filmation out for me, okay?
Thank you.
She was a single empty nester, making a new beginning.
It's like your life restarts.
She's making moves. Things are happening for her.
A new city, a new job, and a new man.
Things are going very well. He's just what she needs.
She's successful, she's in love, everything falls in place.
But then she disappears without a trace.
You coming home tonight or what? Call him when you get his message.
Have you heard anything from her?
Yes, sir.
Her SUV had been parked in the same spot, and that's what prompted him to call the police.
But he isn't the only one worried.
Her daughter hadn't heard from her in like 5 days.
She was afraid something like this might happen.
And the search for answers will reveal why.
He served more than 20 years in prison.
He had all these years to think about the mistakes that he had made.
You just simply can't get away with murder anymore.
November 10th, 2020. It's a busy Tuesday in Atlanta, Georgia, where life is just starting to return to normal after COVID-19 turned everything upside down.
The shutdown really impacted people in their feeling isolated and their connection to people. And then I noticed that folks were outside, at restaurants like life was normal again.
People were still cautious, but people were happy to get back out. And I think it was a big sigh of relief to be back into the world. People started to feel like themselves again.
But that afternoon, things still feel far from normal for Tracy Brock.
Tracy's kind of worried about her mom.
Tracy, who lives in Indiana, speaks to her mom, Shawn Macklin, in Atlanta almost every day.
I've been trying to reach you all weekend.
She considered her mom kind of like her best friend.
And now here we are in the pandemic, in the midst of it. She doesn't know what's happening. She can't get in touch with her mom.
Call me. Love you.
It's now been 5 days since they last spoke.
Tracy is concerned, so she calls and asks the police to go by there to do a welfare check.
Atlanta non-emergency, how can I help you?
Hello. I'm calling to request a welfare check on my mom. She has a broken foot.
Her mother had just hurt her foot, so she had a boot on her leg.
Tracy was concerned, had her mother fallen and couldn't get up?
I'm just worried.
"56-year-old Shawn Macklin had spent most of her life serving others.
Shawn was a compassionate person. She worked in healthcare. She dedicated her life in a field where she could help others.
Folks who work in healthcare love people. They love working with people.
But Shawn's greatest love was her daughter.
She was there for her family, and she was an amazing mother.
Mother and daughter were especially close.
She's like her best friend.
And once Tracy had moved out and started having kids of her own, Shawn was ready to make a big life change.
At 56, you can find yourself in limbo because, no, you're not 20, but you're also not 80. You have a lot of life ahead of you. So now what do I do? Where's my place in the world?
The search took her to Atlanta.
She really wanted to kind of live and enjoy, independence. So she moved down to Atlanta.
She got a job as an office manager with a local healthcare company.
Hi, you have an appointment this morning?
I have an appointment.
But even with a new city and a new job, there's still something missing.
She's looking for a partnership, someone who can help make her feel more stable.
Okay, thank you so much.
Has anyone told you how infectious your smile is?
You can't say infectious in a doctor's office.
And in 2019, she met Bernard Stokes.
He's in his mid-50s, charismatic and charming.
Immediately, they hit it off. There's an instant attraction.
She's excited. Like, ooh, the potential is attractive.
You know, my schedule's pretty flexible. Think you might want to meet me for some coffee?
I'd like that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
That was probably exhilarating for her, you know, and you fall really quick when that happens.
They get together and they start seeing each other. This is what Sean has been waiting for.
And she wasn't about to wait any longer.
The two of them decided to take their relationship to the next level, and they moved in together. Bernard was a maintenance man for an apartment complex, and because of his job, he got an apartment.
He had his own place. She has a good job. He has a good job. So things are going very well for Sean at this point.
She's successful, she's in love, she felt absolutely wonderful.
Okay.
But now Sean's daughter has called the Atlanta police, worried about her mother.
When she called, she said that they usually talk every single day, and she hadn't heard from her in like 5 days.
I'm afraid she might have fallen.
Her mother had recently fractured her foot and was wearing a boot on her leg.
With this boot on her foot, it's probably more challenging to move.
Her daughter said she would have checked on Sean in person, but she lives out of state.
And with the pandemic still a threat, her travel options are limited.
In November of 2020, even though the pandemic was kind of settling down, we were still in limbo in Atlanta. People were still dying because of COVID. It was still a very, very serious disease.
Not being able to see loved ones, not being able to see friends. That whole social dynamic really caused people some stress and anxiety.
No problem. We'll get someone right over there.
Thank you.
A welfare check is basically 911 dispatcher would dispatch an officer out to a location, and the officer would basically knock to see if someone comes to the door. They may walk around, look in windows, looking for any reason for concern.
When the officer gets to Sean's apartment, someone answers his knock.
A man in his 50s opens the door.
It's Sean's boyfriend, Bernard.
You hear about Sean?
He expresses that he's worried about her.
He hasn't seen her since she left for work 4 days ago.
I hadn't seen her in a few days, but I already filed a missing person report.
In Atlanta, Georgia, 56-year-old Sean Macklin was making the most of her newfound freedom.
When you become an empty nester, it's like your life restarts.
She was looking for a life where she can enjoy herself.
And she found the perfect man to grow older with.
He's charismatic, just what she needs now, someone to love on her.
She's successful, she's in love. They were looking forward to building their future.
I hadn't seen her in about 4 or 5 days.
But now Atlanta police are at the couple's apartment after Sean's daughter asked for a welfare check.
She hasn't heard from her mom. She speaks to her mom every single day.
And when Sean's boyfriend Bernard comes to the door, he says he tried to report her missing.
When was that?
A couple of days ago.
And that was the last time you saw her?
It was a couple of days before that.
He said that they had some personal issues going on.
Issues? What type of issues?
Hell, I just asked her to move out.
He said that he and Sean were in the process of splitting up.
He was given the apartment through his work, and so it was her who had to leave. And she agreed.
We still care about each other, but you know it's for the best.
I found an apartment.
He said that she actually was already packing her stuff and preparing to move.
According to Bernard, that's one reason it took him a couple days to call the police and report her missing.
He says on Friday the 6th, Sean got up at her usual time to get ready for work.
I'll be out of here soon.
All right. I can help you move your stuff if you need me to.
Thanks. I'm off to work.
And then she left for work after that?
And that was the last time you saw her?
Yeah.
Bernard says he went back to bed and he didn't get up until it was time for him to go to work.
But he says that when he got home, Sean wasn't there.
Sean didn't come home that night, and Bernard thought maybe she spent the night at a friend's house.
But then the weekend came and went with no sign of her.
It wasn't until Sunday when he started getting worried.
He noticed that her SUV had been parked in the same spot as it was on Thursday night. That's what prompted him to call the police because he thought something was wrong.
I called the cops. They came out, but they didn't believe me.
I called 911 to say, hey, I'm concerned about her.
After the officers looked around, they said that they didn't see anything wrong.
Did I get a good number?
Especially after he explained that Sean was in the process of moving out.
But the officer conducting the welfare check isn't as willing to let things go.
After all, Bernard wasn't the only one who hadn't heard from her.
Had you tried contacting her daughter?
Well, she hasn't made contact with Tracy. That's why I'm here.
She haven't contacted Tracy? Something must be wrong.
Let me make contact with the detectives and I'll be in touch.
After talking to Bernard, the officer passes the information off to detectives.
First, he confirmed that he had called the police and attempted to report her missing.
In fact, they even find body cam footage from the encounter.
Have you heard anything from her? Yes, sir. That's why I called.
In the video, he explains the impeding breakup and how she's moving out.
Yeah, look around. Oh, go ahead. Look. Stuff haven't moved since then? No, sir. And that was my concern.
With little else to go on, the officer's hands are tied.
I looked at the arrest record. She's not showing up on that either, as well as any hospital.
But based on what they've learned from Sean's daughter and Bernard, investigators certainly feel the situation merits a missing persons report.
Yeah, that seems kind of strange. We'll take it from here. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
The detectives started by issuing a subpoena for Sean's cell phone records.
They know the phone records will show where she's been, if she's used the phone at all. It will ping her location.
Then the detectives follow up at the doctor's office where Sean works.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, hello, how are you? Her boss explains that everyone loves her. She's a joy to work with.
She says that Sean is incredibly reliable and a hard worker.
She also says that Sean rarely ever calls in sick.
She always went to work on time.
So it was very surprising and shocking when she didn't show up and didn't call.
I tried to reach out to her Friday.
Sean's manager said that they sent text messages during the morning hours and then stated they tried to call during the afternoon. But phone went straight to voicemail.
She never called you back?
No, which was really unlike her.
So now detectives are curious. Did Sean talk much about her personal life at work?
Her manager says that she was pretty private.
That is, until recently.
She started opening up about issues she was having with Bernard.
They were going through a breakup.
And according to her manager, Sean and Bernard were not on good terms.
This contradicted what Bernard had told detectives.
The manager also said that one big issue stood out.
He was evicting her.
Give me my phone!
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Sean Macklin have learned that her boyfriend, Bernard Stokes, was trying to evict the 56-year-old office manager from their apartment.
The breakup was not as amicable as Bernard had painted the picture.
Her manager actually stated Sean requested Monday off so that she can go to court to deal with the eviction.
Which is one reason Sean's manager wasn't too worried when she didn't show up at work on Friday.
I just thought she took off because, she was trying to find a place or something.
But then she says she received a strange call at the office on Monday.
Bernard called and asked for Sean.
She thought it was strange that he would call her job looking for. When he knew that she was supposed to be in court with him.
I had no idea she was missing.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for your time.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
By the time detectives return to the station from Sean's workplace, the phone records they've requested are waiting for them.
They noticed she hasn't made any outgoing calls since Thursday, the 5th.
But there's several incoming calls, including calls from Bernard and Tracy.
That alone will cause detectives some concern.
However, the incoming call data does allow detectives to track Sean's movements.
The phone companies can tell detectives what location or what tower that person was near.
The phone pinged off of 2 towers.
The first ping was an hour southwest of Atlanta, in the small town of Grantville.
After it pinged in Grantville, it pinged again in Fairburn, Georgia. Now, Fairburn is halfway between Atlanta and Grantville.
So it seems like Sean goes to Grantville and starts making her way back to Atlanta.
And this was 7 hours after Bernard said that he last saw Sean.
And after that, the phone went dead.
It would be alarming if you're saying that the person is missing and then you see activity cease.
But do the phone records mean something happened to Sean? Or that she'd even gone to Grantville?
Someone else could have been in possession of the phone.
Hoping for more information, the detectives contact Sean's daughter, Tracy.
Hello?
They asked if her mother knew anybody in Granville.
I don't think so. She rarely knows anyone outside of work as far as I know. Why?
Well, her phone pinged there recently.
What?
She was already worried about her mom, and now it's even more.
She also told detectives that she's been doing a little digging on her own.
She was able to log into her mom's emails.
And what she found was troubling.
There was no activity since the 5th. There were several important emails that she didn't answer, and one was an approval for a new apartment.
The message was never opened.
Based on the phone activity and the unopened emails, the detectives believe Sean went off the grid sometime Friday.
Detectives asked Tracy, was there anyone who wanted to harm your mom?
And that's when she said she was afraid something like this might happen.
What do you mean?
Well, I didn't want to say anything to begin with because I was hoping it was nothing.
But now, Sean's daughter reveals the awful truth.
Bernard was actually abusive towards her mother.
Are you sure?
Well, that's what she said.
Tracy says it started when her mother became suspicious of Bernard.
Where he's working as a maintenance man. He'll be in their houses for hours. So Miss Macklin would sometimes find it interesting that these women would want to cook for him. Wanted him to come by just to check.
Sean went through Bernard's phone looking for other women's messages and texts.
And it turned out that her suspicions may have been justified.
He was talking to another woman.
The hell are you doing?
And when Sean confronted Bernard about it, he turned violent.
Give me my phone. Give me my phone.
Tracy says that he actually broke Sean's arm.
Give me my phone!
And allegedly, the boot that she had on her foot was also because of him.
Did you ever witness him being violent?
No.
Have you ever heard him threaten her?
Not exactly.
But Tracy does say that her mother was growing increasingly afraid of Bernard.
She even took out a life insurance policy.
Tracy also said that her mother obtained a carry permit and got a gun.
According to her daughter, that's why she'd started looking for a new place.
But she didn't want to leave before having somewhere else to go.
I told her just to get out, go to a shelter if she have to. But she said she would be okay.
So at this point, Tracy is afraid that Bernard really harmed her mom.
The detectives are starting to think so too.
All right.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
When they look into his background, they realize that there had been domestic calls made several times to the apartment.
Now, when police were called to come to Sean's and Bernard's house, they were all verbal arguments.
There isn't any evidence of physical abuse, including the injuries that Tracy claims her mom sustained.
But does that mean that what Sean told her daughter isn't true?
Domestic violence happens behind closed doors and not always is reported.
And in instances where the police will come, nothing will happen because the abuser is so good at hiding and disguising what is actually going on.
However, there are some things that Bernard can't hide from the detectives.
He has a litany of charges.
But what is most shocking is that in 1992, he was convicted of murder.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Sean Macklin have just learned that her boyfriend Bernard has been previously convicted of murder.
In the 1992 murder, he killed his roommate.
At first, he says he murdered his roommate out of self-defense, thinking that the roommate was an intruder.
He told an entire story. How he heard noise, he grabbed a gun, and shot this person by mistake.
It might have worked, if not for one thing.
I'm leaving. Y'all need my money. I don't have your money. I'm leaving. You're not leaving, going anywhere. How you gonna try to make you?
His roommate had a feeling that he was going to do something to him. So what his roommate did was put a recorder in his pocket.
And the recorder told a very different story than the one Bernard gave police.
They actually had an argument. They were arguing about him moving.
This was a dispute over rent.
During this argument, he's asking Stokes questions. Why do you have that gun in your hand? What are you going to do with that gun? And you can hear the gun go off.
The recording even captured Bernard attempting to cover up the crime.
911, what's your emergency?
Stokes calls 911, tell 911 that he believes that someone was trying to break into the home, and he mistakenly shot this roommate.
The tape was more than enough to put Bernard away.
He took that case to trial, he lost, and he was convicted.
He served more than 20 years in prison before being released on parole.
And now that Sean is missing, the detectives wonder if Bernard is making a second attempt at getting away with murder.
When he was caught the first time, he had all these years to kind of think about the mistakes that he had made.
After uncovering Bernard's prior conviction, the detectives reach out to his parole officer.
His PO says that since he's been released, he has been mild-mannered and he's trying to get his life together.
The parole officer also says that Sean knew about his past.
Sean was aware of this murder, and she was trying to help him. She had a loving heart. You know, she wanted to see him succeed.
That says a lot about her personality, right? She may have just believed in him, or maybe she wanted really to believe in love that bad to where she would kind of look past even murder.
But had her faith in Bernard ended up costing Sean her life?
Just because Bernard's parole officer speaks highly of him does not mean that he would not kill again.
Hoping to find out, the detectives head to Bernard's apartment with a search warrant.
How's it going? We got a warrant to search your apartment.
When detectives confront Bernard, he doesn't shy away from his criminal background, nor does he shy away from the domestic calls.
But he does say that Sean was the instigator.
She's jealous, she's controlling. She even tried to call my kid's mom and threaten her. It was crazy.
He definitely tried to make himself into the victim.
According to Bernard, that's why they were splitting up.
He said he just got tired of Sean's jealousy.
He just wanted her to leave.
And when she tried to stall it, she said she had to wait till she get her place.
That's why he had no choice but to file the eviction.
The detectives have their doubts, though.
Eviction wasn't the only way to get rid of Sean.
So she just left? Yeah. And I'm not lying about her. Look here.
He tells detectives he has a video, and you can see how Sean was.
He actually recorded the last argument they had.
The video is only a few seconds long, but you can hear Sean yelling at Bernard from the bathroom.
I don't give a damn.
Shit, that's what I'm saying. You do them and take it out on me.
I ain't taking nothing out on you. I won't take your life out on you. It's your life.
You do.
And Bernard explains that this is a clear indication that she was alive and well the morning of her disappearance.
He says this happened moments before she left for work.
But is it the proof Bernard claims it is?
And do you know where she went after she left? No.
He told him it was none of his business since they were broken up.
And he also says that he went back to sleep after she left for work on Friday morning. And he didn't leave the apartment until it was time for him to go to work, which was around 8 a.m.
That's what Bernard claims, but the detectives aren't willing to take his word for it.
Well, we're gonna take a look around. Hang tight.
And since they have a search warrant, there's nothing he can do to stop them from looking around.
They also luminol the apartment.
Luminol is a chemical that can reveal where someone has cleaned up bloodstains.
At first, the results are disappointing.
That's until they get to the bathroom.
And when we luminol the bathroom, you can see blood.
Lynn's disappearance have just found evidence of blood in the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Bernard Stokes.
Luminol reveals that there is splatters of blood in the bathroom.
You can see blood smears on the bathroom handle, the bathroom sink, and also on the floor.
There's also blood on the molding and a comb on the counter.
It's not enough to prove that anyone was killed in the bathroom, but it is quite suspicious.
Hey, Bernard.
When detectives ask Bernard about the blood, he says he has no idea how it got there.
However, given all they knew about Bernard's criminal past and his alleged abuse of Sean, the detectives didn't believe him.
All right, we're gonna have you come down to the precinct for some more questions. We'll meet you down there. It's fine.
But before they head back to the station, the detectives stop by the apartment complex's management office.
They want to see the surveillance video, the hours surrounding Sean's disappearance.
When they review the video, they get the first evidence that Bernard is lying.
First of all, they're able to see Sean the evening before her disappearance.
On November 5th, around 7 p.m., you see on surveillance video, she exits her car and she goes into her building.
But they never see her leave again.
And there's no chance she could have left out a different exit?
No, we have 17 cameras. It'd have showed up if so.
You roll forward to the next morning?
Sure.
However, the cameras do capture Bernard leaving early the next morning.
They see Bernard leave the apartment on the 6th at 6:52 a.m.
Earlier, in his statement to police, he said he didn't leave till 8 that morning.
And the lie isn't the only thing the cameras catch.
We see him kind of back his pickup truck to the trash compactor area, and the bed was empty.
Unfortunately, the cameras don't pick up what happened.
But when he pulls back out 20 minutes later, there's several items in the bed.
One of the items that they see is a big box.
Where did this box come from? And why does he have it?
For detectives, the answer is simple.
Her body was in that box.
in his hallway. There's no cameras that lead to the compactor where we believe he drug her body before he backed his truck in and picked the body up and put it in the truck.
Bernard then leaves the complex and doesn't return until 4:30 that afternoon.
And guess what's missing from the truck? That big box.
And when he gets out of the truck, Bernard is also wearing different clothes than he had on when he left.
So where did he go for 7 hours? What happened to the stuff in the bed of his truck? And why is he wearing different clothing?
Detectives believe there may be a way to answer at least some of those questions.
Detectives place a trace on his license plate for the truck.
The trace allows detectives to go through the reams of data collected by traffic cameras and license plate readers scattered throughout Metro Atlanta.
You just simply can't get away with murder anymore. We have too much technology.
After requesting the data, the detectives sit down with Bernard.
They want to see if Bernard's going to be honest.
Detectives ask him, what did he do in the moments after Sean left?
Unaware of what detectives have uncovered, Bernard sticks to his story.
I told you after she left, I went back to sleep and I didn't get up to about 8 a.m.
So detectives press him and ask him, did he go outside? And he says no.
You never left the apartment at all? No, I was in bed.
Detectives then let him know, we saw you on camera, and then he explains, finally, oh yeah, I went out to go get a cigar.
Detectives don't believe him at all.
So detectives try to appeal to Bernard's compassion.
You must have loved Sean. Don't you want to help us find her?
Of course.
He acknowledges he cared about her and he wouldn't do anything to hurt her.
But then he reveals something that is very interesting to police.
He tells detectives that he believes Sean and her daughter organized her disappearance.
Why would they do that? To get back at me, I guess.
He said Sean was mad that he was kicking her out.
And you didn't have anything to do with it.
That's what I've been trying to tell you.
But the detectives are about to call his bluff.
So, you don't have a problem taking a polygraph test?
And that's when he shuts down.
He does not want to talk anymore.
Looks like I'm gonna need a lawyer.
Suspected of killing his missing girlfriend, Sean Macklin, 57-year-old Bernard Stokes is now refusing to say more to detectives without an attorney.
He stopped talking as soon as the detective suggested that he take a polygraph.
It's enough to convince the detectives that he's lying.
We know that they were going through problems. She was leaving him. And so, as we know, an indicator of homicide is when the victim of the domestic violence finally decides to leave.
However, something is still missing.
You have a murder case without a body.
Which is why the detectives had high hopes for the license plate recognition data.
And when they receive the results of the trace, they get a clear picture of where Bernard went the morning Sean disappeared.
Bernard left Atlanta and headed to Grantville.
Exactly where Sean's phone pinged.
2 hours later, he was recorded in College Park, a few miles from where Sean's phone last pinged.
Then they pick up his truck in Riverdale at a store.
Through surveillance, we watch him buy new men's clothes, going into the men's bathroom, changing those clothes from the clothes that he had on from when he left the apartment, and then throwing those clothes into the dumpster.
But unfortunately, even with a detailed plot of Bernard's movements that day, detectives still come up short.
They never found her body.
Other than the hits of following him through the course of him driving throughout Georgia, we don't know what he did. That is something that's still a mystery to us.
Bernard, stand up.
Despite that, the detectives place Bernard under arrest for murder.
Phone data, the license plate, the blood in the bathroom, and the surveillance video was enough evidence to make a good case.
But without Sean's body, will it be enough for a conviction when Bernard goes on trial in October of 2023?
These cases are often very hard to prosecute.
That's a very difficult climb because you have jurors wondering, do you really know if this person is dead or not?
I'll be out of here soon.
When they lay out their case, the prosecutors contend that Bernard and Sean got into an argument because she was leaving him.
She got approved for her apartment the day that we believe this disagreement happened. Mr. Stokes knew that.
So you think you're just gonna move out?
I thought that's what you wanted.
It's possible that his goal in evicting Sean was another attempt at maintaining control. And when she did not beg for him back, when he lost that control, he couldn't take it.
The prosecutors admit that they don't know exactly how he killed Sean.
But they argue that her body was in the box Bernard hauled away from his apartment the morning she disappeared.
The prosecution also argues that Bernard only reported Sean missing to cover his tracks.
In addition, and this is how sneaky he was, he actually called Miss Macklin's phone and left voicemails on her phone to cover it up.
You coming home tonight or what? It's late.
When it's the defense's turn, Bernard says that he'd been just as desperate to find Sean as anyone.
Bernard maintained his innocence throughout the trial.
But Bernard's claims make little impression on the jury.
Even without a body, the jury believes that the evidence is sufficient to convict Bernard.
He didn't think that people would take all the steps necessary that would be required to prove him guilty of murder. And, we did.
He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
It's a welcome relief to those wanting to see Bernard off the streets.
When the judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, it was even better. Because we know that he doesn't even have a chance, like he did for the 1992 murder, to get out and hurt anyone else.
But the prosecutors also see Sean's story as a warning to others.
Something that stuck with me in this case was that she stayed because she wanted to wait until she was secure enough to leave. I wish she had left.
It also continues to haunt the family and friends that Sean left behind.
It's challenging because they never found the body. When we're thinking about grief, when we're thinking about closure, without having a body, having a memorial, it doesn't allow you to process your emotional experiences.
And for her daughter, Sean's loss means that her children will grow up without their grandmother.
Grief is tricky. It'll sneak up on you when you least expect it. So when grief comes out of nowhere, you flow with it. You process it. Find the different tools to help you connect to the loved one, to the memories. Process your emotional experiences. That way you don't get stuck in the quicksand.
Sean was a good woman who raised her daughter, who built a career and worked hard for herself. She thought she was lucky to find love again in her 50s, but instead, it ended her life.
It was a quiet autumn evening in October 2005 when the peaceful facade of a close-knit suburban neighborhood shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. A porch light flickered over an empty driveway. A front door stood unlocked, swinging gently in the chilly October breeze. Inside, a dinner table was set for one. a mug of tea still faint with steam, and a life vanished without a trace. No signs of forced entry. No shattered glass. No bloody footprints trailing across the hardwood floor. Just an agonizing, deafening silence that would echo through the town for more than 2 decades. For 21 long years, the disappearance was dubbed the mystery that time forgot, a chilling anomaly frozen in the archives of local law enforcement, a cold case that haunted the nightmares of every family living on that idyllic cul-de-sac. Headlines splashed across regional newspapers, screaming the same unanswered question. Where is she? Investigators chased hundreds of dead-end leads, sifted through thousands of tips, and interviewed everyone from passing delivery drivers to distant relatives. But every trail grew cold. Every lead crumbled into dust. The quiet neighborhood moved on, or at least tried to, carrying the invisible weight of an open wound, unaware that the answer to their terror wasn't hiding in some distant state or lurking in the dark corners of an anonymous highway. It was living right next door. Then came the breakthrough that no one saw coming. The breaking news banner flashed across television screens, sending shockwaves through the community. Notorious 2005 cold case solved, former neighbor taken into custody. The sudden, dramatic arrest brought squad cars, forensic vans, and mobile news units swarming back to the very street where the nightmare had begun 21 years earlier. Yellow crime scene tape once again fluttered in the breeze, encircling a quaint 2-story house that had sat quietly across the lawn from the victim's driveway all along. Neighbors gathered on their lawns in utter disbelief as federal agents and state investigators escorted an elderly, mild-mannered man in handcuffs down his front steps. The man who had attended community vigils. The man who had offered words of comfort to grieving relatives. The man who had watched the police search parties from his porch with a cold, calculated curiosity. The wolf hadn't been hunting from afar. He had been living in plain sight, watching the world search for a ghost he had created. To understand the sheer magnitude of this revelation, you have to rewind to the night it all began. In late October 2005, the victim, a 32-year-old high school biology teacher named Clara Vance, was at the peak of her life. Known for her warmth, her sharp intellect, and her unwavering dedication to her students, Clara was a beloved pillar of the Oak Ridge community. She lived alone in a charming, renovated craftsman home on Elmwood Lane, a quiet suburban corridor where neighbors knew each other by name, borrowed lawnmowers, and left their back doors unlocked without a second thought. Crime was something that happened in distant cities, splashed across late-night broadcasts, never on Elmwood Lane. On the night of October 24, 2005, Clara spoke with her mother on the phone around 7:45 p.m. She mentioned she was wrapping up grading papers, making a light dinner, and planning to call it an early night. Her voice was light, relaxed, completely devoid of fear or distress. Nothing in her tone suggested that danger was looming just feet from her front door. That 20-minute phone conversation would be the last time anyone ever heard Clara Vance alive. When Clara failed to show up for her first period class the following morning, alarm bells immediately began to ring. Clara was punctuality personified. She had never missed a day of school without calling in advance. By 10 a.m., a concerned colleague drove to her house to check on her. What they found set off a chain reaction of panic. Clara's car was parked in the driveway. Her purse, keys, and cell phone were sitting on the kitchen counter. A half-eaten meal sat on the table. The back door was unlatched, slightly ajar, letting in the damp morning mist. It was as if Clara had simply evaporated into thin air in the middle of her evening routine. When detectives arrived on scene, they were met with a crime scene defined not by what was present, but by what was missing. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned chairs, no broken dishes, no struggle marks on the carpet. Forensic technicians searched meticulously for latent fingerprints, foreign DNA, or forced entry marks around windows and doors, but found virtually nothing. The house was immaculate. It was a phantom crime scene, clean, quiet, and terrifyingly precise. As the news of Clara's disappearance spread, panic gripped the town of Oak Ridge. The innocent bubble of suburban security burst overnight. Search parties met at sunrise, fanning out into the surrounding woods, draining local ponds, and searching abandoned warehouses. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting through the autumn darkness, searching for any sign of the missing teacher. Police set up checkpoints along Elmwood Lane, questioning motorists and logging every vehicle that passed through the area. Among the most cooperative individuals during those harrowing early days was Clara's immediate neighbor across the lawn, Arthur Pendleton. A 52-year-old quiet handyman and former carpenter who lived alone, Pendleton was a familiar face on the block. He was the neighbor who always waved, helped shovel snow in the winter, and offered a helping hand with yard work. When detectives questioned him during the initial canvass, Pendleton expressed deep concern and shock over Clara's disappearance. He told officers he had been inside watching television all evening and hadn't heard or seen a single suspicious thing. He even allowed officers to step inside his entryway and look around his garage. He seemed like nothing more than a concerned, helpful neighbor doing his civic duty. Days turned into weeks. Weeks stretched into agonizing months. The media circus that had descended upon Oak Ridge slowly packed up its cameras and moved on to the next national headline. The yellow crime scene tape around Clara's house weathered and tore away in the winter winds. The search parties dispersed. The tips slowed from a flood to a trickle, and eventually to nothing at all. Clara Vance became a haunting photograph on a missing person poster fading under the sun in local storefront windows. For years, investigators revisited the file. Detective Thomas Miller, the lead investigator assigned to the case, refused to let Clara's name become just another cold statistic. Miller kept Clara's framed photograph on his desk, a daily reminder of the promise he had made to her grieving family. He re-interviewed former suspects, re-examined old physical evidence using updated chemical reagents, and tracked down every rumor that circulated in the dark corners of the internet. Yet, despite his relentless effort, the case remained stubbornly cold. It was a digital brick wall. The killer had left no obvious biological trail, no murder weapon, and no body. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that the technology required to unlock the truth hadn't been invented yet. The secret to cracking the 2005 disappearance wasn't hidden in a secret confession or an undiscovered witness statement buried in a dusty filing cabinet. It was waiting in the silent, microscopic world of touch DNA and advanced genetic genealogy, tools that would take 2 decades to mature into the ultimate weapon against untraceable predators. Behind the scenes, as the years ticked by, the perpetrator lived a life of chilling normalcy. Arthur Pendleton remained on Elmwood Lane for years after Clara disappeared, tending to his lawn, greeting new neighbors who moved onto the block, and watching the town slowly heal from a trauma he had personally inflicted. He lived right across from the house where Clara had spent her final moments, a silent spectator to the ongoing grief of a community. The sheer audacity of his proximity was staggering. He had bet everything on the assumption that if he stayed quiet, stayed cooperative, and blended into the background, the world would eventually forget. He was wrong. Time may have dulled the town's immediate terror, but it never erased the relentless drive of the justice system. Decades later, a dedicated cold case unit would reopen file 05-1024 with a fresh set of eyes and revolutionary forensic tools. And when they re-examined a single, microscopic speck of material collected from the interior latch of Clara's back door in 2005, the phantom crime scene finally began to speak. The microscopic speck of material sat locked inside an airtight evidence vault for 21 years, suspended in time while the world outside evolved. Back in October 2005, the technology available to crime scene technicians could only do so much with degraded, low-copy biological samples. Touch DNA was in its infancy, often yielding incomplete genetic profiles that raised more questions than answers. But science is an unstoppable engine, grinding forward year after year, refusing to let old crimes stay hidden forever. In 2026, the Cold Case Task Force resubmitted the original swab taken from the interior latch of Clara Vance's rear door to a state-of-the-art forensic laboratory specializing in advanced genetic genealogy and modern DNA extraction. What used to require a drop of blood could now be extracted from a ghost of a touch, a few skin cells shed in a split second of panicked motion. When the lab results returned, They didn't just yield a partial match, they delivered a full, pristine, 9-marker STR profile that had remained invisible on the brass hardware for over 2 decades. The genetic fingerprint didn't immediately trigger an alarm in the National Offender Database, CODIS, because the perpetrator had never been convicted of a felony crime. But investigators didn't stop there. They turned to public forensic genealogy databases, mapping the unknown sample against sprawling family trees built from consumer DNA tests. Step by step, generation by generation, forensic genealogists traced the genetic branches backward through time, untangling third-cousin matches and distant ancestral lines until the sprawling web began to converge on a single localized lineage right in the heart of Oak Ridge. The digital map narrowed down the possibilities with terrifying precision. It didn't point to an out-of-state transient. It didn't point to an escaped convict or a drifting stranger passing through on the highway. The genetic compass swung directly toward a family that had resided on Elmwood Lane for over half a century. When investigators cross-referenced the names on that family tree against the original 2005 neighborhood canvas logs, one name burned through the page like acid: Arthur Pendleton. The realization hit Detective Miller and the cold case team with the force of a freight train. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just a name on a suspect list. He was the neighbor who had stood on his lawn 21 years ago, wringing his hands, offering coffee to tired search teams, and expressing deep, solemn sorrow over Clara's disappearance. He was the soft-spoken carpenter who had lived 50 feet from her driveway, watching every police car come and go, monitoring the progress of the investigation from his living room window. He had been evaluated, dismissed, and forgotten, hidden behind the bulletproof armor of suburban mundane respectability. Investigators knew that a genetic link through family lineage was a massive breakthrough, but to secure an ironclad arrest warrant for a 21-year-old capital crime, they needed Pendleton's direct, unassailable DNA. They couldn't simply knock on his door and ask for a cheek swab. Doing so would instantly tip off a man who had successfully kept a horrifying secret for over 2 decades, risking his flight or worse, the destruction of any physical evidence he might still possess. The cold case unit initiated a dark, covert surveillance operation targeting the 73-year-old retiree. For 2 agonizing weeks, undercover vehicles equipped with long-range telephoto lenses sat parked along the quiet streets near Pendleton's daily routes. They watched a man who moved with slow, methodical deliberation. He tended his garden, drove a faded blue pickup truck to the local hardware store, and sat alone on his porch in the late afternoon heat. To anyone passing by, he was the picture of a quiet, harmless senior citizen spending his golden years in peaceful solitude. But to the team watching through the glass, he was a monster hiding behind an aging mask, carrying the answer to a tragedy that had broken a town's heart. The break came on a rainy Tuesday morning outside a local diner where Pendleton regularly grabbed breakfast. Undercover officers sat 2 booths away, watching every move as he finished his coffee and eggs. When Pendleton wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, dropped a few bills on the table, and walked out to his truck, an agent stepped up immediately, placing the discarded napkin, a plastic coffee stirrer, and a disposable water cup into sterile evidence bags. The biological material was rushed directly to the state lab under emergency protocols. 48 hours later, the laboratory director called Detective Miller directly. The confirmation was absolute. The touch DNA recovered from the interior latch of Clara Vance's back door in 2005 was a 1 in a billion match to the discarded coffee stirrer used by Arthur Pendleton. The Phantom had finally been given a name, a face, and a biological link to the crime scene he swore he had never entered. Armed with the DNA match, a grand jury issued a sealed indictment for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated burglary. The strategy was executed with swift, terrifying efficiency. Tactical teams and federal agents blocked off both ends of Elmwood Lane at dawn, swarming the modest home Arthur Pendleton had occupied for decades. When the heavy battering ram struck the front door, shouting officers flooded the entryway, securing the suspect before he could even rise from his armchair. The man who had spent 21 years believing he had committed the perfect crime was brought out into the pale morning light in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound resignation. As news crews descended on the street, the contrast between the past and the present was suffocating. The very lawn where search teams had gathered 2 decades prior was now carpeted with forensic mobile labs, digital scanning equipment, and evidence collection units. Neighbors spilled out onto their porches, gasping as they recognized the man being ushered into the back of a black state police cruiser. The quiet handyman, the polite neighbor. The man who had lived across the lawn from Clara Vance was now locked in heavy steel restraints, facing the ultimate reckoning for a night of horror that had remained buried in the dark for 21 long years. Inside the police department's interrogation facility, the atmosphere was suffocating. Heavy concrete walls, a single stainless steel table, and a two-way mirror that reflected the stark light of fluorescent bulbs. Arthur Pendleton sat in the metal chair, his hands cuffed in his lap, looking small, frail, and entirely stripped of the quiet dignity he had projected for decades. Across from him sat Detective Thomas Miller, holding the thick, yellowed 2005 case file alongside a sleek, white folder containing the fresh forensic reports from 2026. 2 eras of justice colliding in a single room. The interrogation began not with aggressive accusations, but with a slow, deliberate pressure. Miller laid out the evidence piece by piece, spreading modern digital renderings of the crime scene alongside the DNA analysis reports. For the first 2 hours, Pendleton tried to maintain his defense, offering raspy, weak denials. He claimed he must have touched Clara's door days before she disappeared while helping her carry groceries. He claimed he was being framed. He claimed his memory was failing him in his old age. But Miller dismantled every lie with cold, mathematical precision. The touch DNA wasn't on the outside handle where a helpful neighbor might place a hand. It was deposited deep inside the interior latch mechanism, pressed firmly under extreme force in the middle of a violent, forced entry. As the hours dragged into late afternoon, the weight of his own lies began to crush Pendleton. The mask of the harmless old neighbor cracked, revealing the cold, calculating mind beneath. His breathing grew heavy, his eyes fixed on the photograph of Clara Vance resting on the center of the table. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it would shatter the glass. Finally, Pendleton slumped forward, buried his face in his trembling, liver-spotted hands, and let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a man who had run out of road, run out of time, and run out of lies. The sound that escaped Arthur Pendleton's throat in that interrogation room was not a sob. It was a dry, hollow rattle, the air leaving a lungs full of air built on 21 years of fabricated innocence. Detective Miller didn't press. He sat entirely still, watching the old man's knuckles turn white against the cold stainless steel table. In the silence between them, the fluorescent lights hummed a sterile, steady tone. The tape rolled, the red recording light blinking like a heartbeat in the corner of the room. Every lens, every observer behind the two-way mirror was focused on a single point, the moment a 2-decade-old life finally fractured beyond repair. When Pendleton raised his head, the pathetic, bewildered retiree persona was gone. In its place sat an unnerving, flat demeanor. His eyes were devoid of panic, replaced by the chilling detachment of a man who had calculated every risk decades ago and was now simply accepting the ledger's final balance. He looked directly at the photograph of Clara Vance lying on the table, the bright, smiling face of a young teacher who had trusted her neighborhood, and began to speak in a low, measured voice that sent an icy chill straight through the room. The narrative he unfolded was a masterclass in quiet, predatory obsession. For months leading up to October 2005, Pendleton hadn't just lived across the lawn. He had systematically studied Clara's life. From the vantage point of his second-story workshop window, hidden behind half-drawn blinds, he had mapped her routines down to the minute. He knew when her lights went on, when her phone rang, when she left for work, and when she sat down alone to grade papers in her kitchen. To the rest of Elmwood Lane, he was the harmless, widowed carpenter who minded his own business. In reality, he was a silent spectator building a dark, boundary-crossing fantasy within the confines of his own home. On the night of October 24th, 2005, that fantasy turned into an irresistible impulse. Pendleton had watched Clara pull her car into the driveway, see her kitchen lights illuminate the ground, and watch through her uncurtained window as she spoke on the phone to her mother. He knew she lived alone. He knew the neighborhood was settled in for the night. And he knew that the lock on her back screen door had a loose latch, a minor repair job Clara had mentioned to him in passing just 2 weeks prior. A repair he had deliberately offered to fix someday soon, knowing full well he would use that very flaw as his point of entry. When the clock struck 8:15 p.m., shortly after Clara hung up the phone, Pendleton, dressed in dark, heavy clothing, bypassed his own front yard and slipped through the shadow line dividing their properties. He didn't rush. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged on that street. Slipping around to the rear of Clara's house, he reached out with gloved hands, or so he thought, and manipulated the faulty latch on the back porch door. But in his haste and the darkness of the evening, his bare thumb slipped past the hem of his canvas work glove, pressing hard against the interior mechanism to force the bolt clear. That single, split-second error, a fraction of an inch of exposed skin, was the tiny biological anchor that would drag him down 21 years later. Once inside, the intrusion was swift, silent, and absolute. Clara never had a chance to scream, to reach for her phone, or to run. Pendleton ambushed her in the narrow hallway between her kitchen and living room, overpowering her before her brain could even register that the familiar face of her neighbor was now the monster invading her sanctuary. He had brought heavy zip ties and restraint materials concealed in his jacket pockets, tools of a premeditated attack that left no room for coincidence or chance. Within 3 minutes, Clara Vance was bound, gagged, and silenced inside her own home, while her tea remained warm on the dining table. What happened next explained why 21 years of massive ground searches, cadaver dogs, and aerial infrared sweeps had yielded nothing. Pendleton didn't march her out the front door or drag her across the street in broad daylight. He waited in the dark kitchen with his victim for nearly 2 hours, listening to the quiet rhythm of Elmwood Lane as neighbors turned off their televisions and went to bed. At 10:30 p.m., under the cover of a dense, autumnal fog that had settled low over Oak Ridge, he moved her out through the back door, utilizing an overgrown drainage easement that ran behind the properties directly into his own detached garage. Her home was left pristine because the violence hadn't occurred there. It was contained, controlled, and moved across a dark lawn into an isolated building. For 3 days, while police officers knocked on doors, set up command posts, and organized community search parties, Clara Vance was held captive less than 100 yards from where Detective Miller stood taking initial statements. Pendleton had participated in the searches during the day, wiping sweat from his forehead alongside frantic community members, and then walked back to his garage at night to maintain control over his crime. When Miller asked the ultimate question, the question that had haunted Clara's family for over 7 decades of combined living, Pendleton didn't flinch. He provided coordinates to a remote, abandoned parcel of land he had owned through an obscure holding company in a neighboring county, a dense patch of timberland near an old quarry that had been cleared and overlooked by investigators in 2005. He had buried her deep beneath a concrete slab he poured himself under the guise of building a hunting shed foundation just 4 days after her disappearance. He had poured the concrete while the missing person posters were being taped to the windows of the town square. The confession was brutal, exhaustive, and chillingly precise. There was no remorse in his voice, no plea for forgiveness, no sudden awakening of conscience. It was a cold accounting of facts, delivered like a contractor reviewing an old building blueprint. He had kept the secret not out of guilt, but out of a supreme, arrogant belief in his own intellectual superiority. He believed he was smarter than the police, smarter than the forensic teams, and immune to the march of time. Behind the two-way mirror, cold case investigators leaned in, their faces pale as the full picture of the horror settled over them. The mystery that had paralyzed an entire town for 2 decades wasn't an act of random highway violence or a random home invasion by an unknown drifter. It was an act of intimate, neighborly betrayal. The man who had helped search for her was the man who had taken her. The man who had offered comfort was the man who had inflicted the nightmare. And as the final words of Pendleton's statement echoed in the interrogation room, The silence that followed was heavy with a dark, suffocating truth. The monster had never been at the gates. He had been standing right outside her window, waiting for the light to go out. The echo of Arthur Pendleton's confession hung in the interrogation room like a heavy, toxic vapor. Outside the reinforced door, the wheels of justice, once stalled for over 2 decades, began to turn with ruthless, frantic speed. It was nearly midnight, but no one in the cold case task force was going home. The confession was on tape, recorded in crystal-clear digital audio and high-definition video, but a confession alone was not enough to bring absolute, undeniable finality to the memory of Clara Vance. They needed recovery. They needed to find the quiet parcel of land near the old quarry, break through 21 years of concrete, and bring Clara home. While Pendleton was processed and escorted down to a high-security holding cell, a convoy of state police cruisers, forensic excavation units, and mobile command vehicles assembled in the precinct parking lot. Headlights cut through the dark, damp night air as the fleet rolled out toward the neighboring county. Detective Thomas Miller rode in the lead cruiser, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For 21 years, he had carried Clara's case file like an anchor around his neck. Now, as the convoy sped down the desolate Tulane highway, the reality of what they were about to uncover weighed heavier than any unsolved mystery ever could. The coordinates Pendleton provided led the convoy down a winding, unpaved logging road overgrown with thick brush and low-hanging branches. The gravel crunched under heavy tires as the vehicles pulled onto an abandoned, 5-acre plot surrounded by dense pine trees. The site was silent, save for the wind rustling through the canopy and the distant hum of the nearby quarry operations that had long since shut down. In the center of a small clearing stood the decayed, wooden skeleton of an unfinished hunting shed, its roof caved in, its timber grayed by decades of rain, snow, and neglect. Work lights flooded the clearing with a harsh, artificial glare, casting long, dramatic shadows against the tree line. Forensic anthropologists and excavation technicians moved into the structure with ground-penetrating radar units. The equipment glided slowly over the rough, hand-poured concrete slab that formed the floor of the ruined shed. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the low, rhythmic beep of the radar unit analyzing the density of the earth beneath the concrete. Then the operator stopped. He looked up at Miller, his face grim, and nodded toward a distinct anomaly on the digital monitor, a dark, defined void buried 4 feet under the solid stone layer. Heavy machinery was brought in. The sharp, deafening sound of a hydraulic jackhammer tore through the night, shattering the silence of the woods as it bit into the weathered concrete. Chunk by chunk, the barrier Pendleton had poured to entomb his crime was broken away and removed by hand. Forensic technicians dropped to their knees, switching from heavy tools to fine trowels, brushes, and handheld sifters as they reached the dark, damp soil beneath. It was grueling, painstaking work that stretched into the early hours of the morning. As the first pale rays of dawn began to bleed through the autumn sky, the lead anthropologist called for complete silence. There, resting beneath 2 decades of packed earth and stone, lay the definitive physical proof of Arthur Pendleton's nightmare. The site was meticulously documented, photographed, and processed. Every thread of decayed fabric, every metallic zipper, every personal item was preserved with sacred care. The 21-year-old ghost of Oak Ridge had finally been recovered from the dark. By 8 a.m., the official confirmation was relayed back to the main station. The news broke nationally within the hour. Television networks interrupted regular programming with urgent red banners flashing across screens. Body of Clara Vance recovered in 2005 cold case investigation. The news struck Oak Ridge like a seismic wave. The lingering ambiguity that had hovered over the town for a generation vanished, replaced by a raw, overwhelming wave of collective grief and shock. The mystery was over, but the reality of the horror was far worse than anyone had ever imagined. Residents gathered at the corner of Elmwood Lane, staring past the police barricades at the 2 houses standing across from each other, the victim's home, preserved in memory, and the killer's home, now crawling with federal agents wearing white suits and respirator masks. Inside Pendleton's house, search warrants were being executed with surgical precision. Investigators were no longer just looking for evidence of Clara's murder. They were searching for answers to a much terrifying question. Was Clara Vance his only victim? Pendleton had lived a long, quiet, transient life before settling on Elmwood Lane in the late 1990s. He had worked as an independent contractor, traveling across 3 state lines for various carpentry and construction projects throughout the 1980s and 1990s. As agents systematically dismantled his home, pulling down drywall, tearing up floorboards, and cataloging decades of accumulated clutter in his basement workshop, they uncovered a hidden storage cavity constructed behind a false furnace wall. Inside the hidden space sat a dusty, metal military footlocker secured with a heavy brass padlock. When locksmiths cut the latch, the agents inside the room went dead quiet. Stored inside were neatly organized manila folders, old newspaper clippings detailing unsolved missing women across 3 counties, and a series of small, unlabeled velvet pouches. Inside those pouches were personal items, a single silver earring, a delicate charm bracelet, a worn leather key ring, trophies taken from lives stolen across a 30-year span. The discovery transformed the investigation from a local cold case resolution into an active, multi-jurisdictional serial murder task force. The quiet handyman from Elmwood Lane wasn't just a neighbor who had snapped on an October night in 2005. He was a methodical, calculating predator who had spent decades honing his ability to walk among normal society while maintaining a hidden trail of devastation in his wake. Back at the station, Detective Miller sat at his desk, staring at the newly opened binders lining the war room walls. The relief of finding Clara was overshadowed by the staggering horror of what had been concealed in the house across the lawn all along. The man they had taken into custody wasn't just facing the end of his life behind bars. He was about to become the centerpiece of one of the most chilling forensic reckonings in regional history. Part 5. The metal footlocker pulled from behind Arthur Pendleton's furnace wall threw open a dark, expansive vault of forgotten histories. The small velvet pouches didn't just contain trinkets, they contained tiny, frozen remnants of shattered lives. Within 48 hours of the discovery, state police agencies across 3 neighboring states were mobilized. Cold case files dating back to the late 1970s, dusted off from bottom drawers and buried computer archives, were rushed to the Task Force Command Center in Oak Ridge. The quiet carpenter was no longer just the suspect in the 2005 disappearance of Clara Vance. He was now the focal point of a sprawling regional task force aimed at dismantling a decades-long legacy of undetected violence. Forensic specialists worked in shifts around the clock, analyzing each item recovered from the footlocker under high-powered electron microscopes and subjecting them to ultrasensitive DNA retrieval techniques. One item in particular, a delicate silver charm bracelet featuring a worn horseshoe clasp, yielded a breakthrough in a 1991 cold case from a small agricultural town 90 miles south of Oak Ridge. A 22-year-old college student named Elena Rostova had vanished from a gas station parking lot late one rainy night after her car broke down. Her vehicle had been found abandoned with the hood popped, no signs of a struggle, and her purse still sitting on the passenger seat. For 35 years, her family had lived in the agonizing dark. When forensic lab technicians recovered partial touch DNA from the inner link of that silver bracelet, it didn't match the victim. It matched Arthur Pendleton. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Pendleton had used his professional background as a carpenter, contractor, and handyman to move fluidly through rural communities and quiet suburbs alike, without ever drawing suspicion. He was the helpful stranger pulling over on a dark shoulder with a toolbox in the trunk. He was the quiet worker doing late-night renovations on commercial buildings. He was the neighbor who kept his lawn immaculate while holding dark, calculated secrets behind locked doors. He operated in the margins of society, never leaving forced entry marks, never engaging in loud altercations, and relying on absolute, agonizing silence to erase his footsteps. In the interrogation room, Detective Miller faced Pendleton once again. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. The 73-year-old suspect sat under the glare of the lights, his physical frame appearing smaller, yet his gaze remained utterly cold and impassive. When Miller laid out the photograph of the silver charm bracelet next to a yellowed missing person poster from 1991, Pendleton didn't offer a denial. He simply stared at the image with a faint, disturbing glint of nostalgia in his eyes. "You thought you were a ghost," Miller said, his voice low, steady, and cut with iron. "You thought if you buried them deep enough and waited long enough, the world would just keep turning and forget. But the world didn't forget, Arthur. The science caught up to you. The people you took have names, they have families, and now they have their voices back." Pendleton leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the metal table, the chains of his handcuffs clinking softly against the steel. When he spoke, his tone was completely devoid of shame or anxiety. He talked about his crimes not as horrific acts of violence, but as a series of technical problems he had successfully solved over a lifetime. He described the mechanics of his movements, the routes he chose to avoid early traffic cameras, and the precise ways he exploited the trust of people who thought they were safe in their own neighborhoods. It was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a true sociopath, a man who viewed human beings as mere targets and the law as an inferior obstacle he had outsmarted for half a century. As Pendleton detailed 2 additional cold cases from the mid-1980s, investigators across the state worked feverishly to verify every detail against land deeds, historic construction records, and employment logs. Every date he mentioned placed him directly at job sites near the locations where young women had vanished. He had used his trade to build literal graves within foundations, behind retaining walls, and beneath remote concrete slabs across the region, using his professional routine as the ultimate camouflage. Meanwhile, back on Elmwood Lane, the emotional impact of these revelations reached a boiling point. The quiet neighborhood had spent 21 years assuming that Clara's disappearance was an isolated, unimaginable tragedy that had struck their street like lightning out of a blue sky. To learn that their quiet neighbor was a prolifically active serial killer who had lived among them, waved to their children, and attended their summer block parties was a revelation that fundamentally shook their sense of reality. The innocent, trusting atmosphere of the suburban community was shattered forever, replaced by a lingering, hyper-vigilant paranoia. Community members erected a permanent memorial at the edge of Clara Vance's former driveway. Bouquets of flowers, glowing candles, handwritten letters, and framed photographs covered the stone boundary line. People who had grown up on the street, children who had walked past Pendleton's house every day on their way to the school bus, returned as adults, standing in silent tears at the police tape line. They were grieving not just for Clara, but for the lost innocence of an entire era. As the state attorney general's office prepared a comprehensive, multi-count indictment including capital murder, kidnapping, and multiple counts of aggravated felonious assault, the legal team ensured that every single piece of forensic evidence was airtight. There would be no technicalities. There would be no loopholes. The paper trail, the genetic genealogy, the recovered physical trophies, and the recorded confessions formed an unassailable fortress of proof. Detective Miller stood in the central war room of the police station late that evening, looking up at the massive wall chart connecting the dots between 2005, 1991, and the dark decades prior. The board was covered in red lines, timeline markers, and photos of victims whose stories were finally being brought into the light. The long, dark hallway of uncertainty was closing. The ghost of Oak Ridge had been stripped of his mystery, brought out of the shadows, and placed firmly into the unrelenting grip of the justice system. The reckoning wasn't just coming, it was already here. Part 6. The formal indictment of Arthur Pendleton was handed down on a cold, gray morning in late November 2026. The courtroom was packed to absolute capacity, filled with local residents, federal agents, seasoned investigators, and the surviving family members of victims whose cold cases had spanned over 4 decades. When Pendleton was led inside, wearing a dark orange jumpsuit with heavy chains wrapped tightly around his waist, he walked with a slow, mechanical stride. His head was bowed slightly, not out of remorse, but under the physical weight of his age and the absolute, inescapable reality of his situation. The quiet carpenter who had once blended seamlessly into the backdrop of suburban life was now the single focal point of an entire state's collective fury and demands for justice. The prosecutor stood before the judge, her voice steady and ringing clear through the high-ceilinged room as she read through the multi-page document detailing decades of terror. Count after count echoed in the solemn air: capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, felonious assault, and the deliberate concealment of human remains. The narrative laid out in the indictment left no room for speculation or doubt. It systematically dismantled any lingering belief that Arthur Pendleton was a confused old man caught up in a tragic misunderstanding. The evidence proved he was a calculated, patient predator who had spent his adult life turning innocent human lives into dark secrets buried under sheets of poured concrete. While the legal machinery churned through preliminary hearings and formal motions, the forensic excavation team at the quarry site had concluded their work. The site was meticulously catalogued, cleared, and secured. The physical remains of Clara Vance had been transferred to the state medical examiner's office, where modern forensic pathology finally confirmed what the investigation had already uncovered. The physical evidence told a story of absolute precision and terrifying control. Every mark, every trace element matched the timeline and details provided during Pendleton's lengthy interrogation sessions with Detective Miller. There were no contradictions. The truth had finally caught up with 21 years of manufactured silence. For Detective Thomas Miller, the formal identification and return of Clara's remains to her family marked a profound, heavy milestone. He personally drove to the home of Clara's aging parents to deliver the official confirmation. Sitting in the living room that had remained virtually frozen in time since October 2005, a room where missing person flyers had once sat stacked on the coffee table, Miller placed his hand over the worn hands of Clara's mother. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations of victory, just a quiet, solemn nod that signaled the long, agonizing search was finally over. The phantom that had stolen their daughter had been identified, caught, and brought to heel, and Clara was finally coming home to be laid to rest with the dignity she deserved. In the weeks following the arraignment, the impact of the case continued to ripple outward through law enforcement agencies nationwide. The Pendleton file became a landmark study in modern forensic genealogy and cold case management. Investigative units from across the country sent representatives to study how a single, microscopic touch DNA sample collected from an interior door latch in 2005 and preserved in a temperature-controlled vault for 2 decades had unlocked a series of interconnected crimes spanning 40 years. What had once seemed like an impossible brick wall had been dismantled entirely by the convergence of relentless police work and cutting-edge genetic science. Yet, inside the walls of the state correctional facility, Pendleton seemed largely indifferent to the legal storm gathering around him. His defense attorneys, realizing the overwhelming, unassailable nature of the physical and genetic evidence, began quiet negotiations with the prosecution. The goal was simple: avoid a long, drawn-out capital trial that would subject the surviving families to further trauma in exchange for full, unvarnished disclosures about every single crime Pendleton had ever committed. The prosecution held all the cards, but they demanded one non-negotiable condition. Pendleton had to walk investigators through every detail, every location, and every trophy recovered from his hidden footlocker, leaving 0 unanswered questions behind. During these specialized proffer sessions, held in a heavily guarded conference room inside the prison, Pendleton mapped out the timeline of his life with chilling clarity. He spoke without emotion, detailing how he selected his targets, how he utilized his construction knowledge to create unfindable burial locations, and how he maintained a quiet, invisible existence right in front of the authorities. He confessed to crimes that had never even been linked to a suspect, cases where missing persons had been assumed to have run away or fallen victim to natural accidents in remote wilderness areas. The sheer scope of his actions painted the picture of a man who had treated human life as nothing more than a series of disposable moments in his own dark, private existence. As the proffer sessions neared their conclusion, the legal team prepared for the final sentencing hearing. The town of Oak Ridge was preparing as well. The quiet street of Elmwood Lane was slowly regaining its breath, though it would never be quite the same. The house across the lawn, the place where Pendleton had lived and watched the search teams for 2 decades, was scheduled for complete demolition by municipal order. The community wanted no physical monument to the monster who had hidden among them. They wanted the structure razed, the ground cleared, and the space transformed into a permanent green space dedicated to the memory of the lives that had been lost. Detective Miller stood on the edge of Elmwood Lane late one afternoon as the winter cold set in, watching the heavy machinery position itself outside Pendleton's former home. The wrecking ball swung with a loud, hollow thud, shattering the front porch where the quiet neighbor had once sat and waved to passing police cars. With every piece of timber that fell, a part of the long, dark shadow that had hung over the street for 21 years seemed to break apart and drift away in the freezing air. The hunt was officially over. The truth was fully exposed, and the quiet town was finally beginning the long, necessary process of reclaiming its peace. The roar of the demolition machinery on Elmwood Lane echoed through the cold morning air like a final, dramatic exorcism. Wall by wall, timber by timber, the house that Arthur Pendleton had occupied for over 20 years collapsed into a jagged pile of plaster, wood, and twisted wire. The neighborhood residents stood on their lawns in silence, wrapped in heavy winter coats, watching the structure where a predator had hidden in plain sight be pulverized into dust. There was no cheer from the crowd, no triumphant applause. Just a quiet, collective exhale that rippled across the block as the physical footprint of a monster was swept into steel dumpsters and hauled away forever. As the physical site was cleared, the legal system was delivering its own crushing, final verdict inside the county courthouse. The sentencing hearing for Arthur Pendleton brought a definitive close to the judicial saga that had dominated regional news for months. With a mountain of forensic evidence, the pristine touch DNA match, the recovered physical trophies, and his own exhaustive confessions, there was no room left for appeal or legal maneuver. Pendleton sat at the defense table in a wheelchair, his hands cuffed to his lap, listening in silence as the judge delivered his final order. Multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind the cold concrete walls of a maximum security state penitentiary. For the family of Clara Vance, the sentencing was the closing of a painful, 21-year-old chapter that had dictated every waking moment of their lives. In the courtroom, Clara's brother stood before the bench to read a victim impact statement. His voice was steady, resounding off the high wood paneling as he looked directly at the aging man sitting in the wheelchair. He spoke not of hate, but of endurance, how the memory of Clara's warmth, her intelligence, and her kindness had outlasted the cold, calculated cruelty of the man who tried to erase her. He declared that Pendleton had failed in his ultimate goal. He had not turned Clara into a forgotten ghost, but into an enduring light that brought a community together and exposed a killer to the world. Back at the Oak Ridge Police Department, the atmosphere in the Homicide Division was one of quiet reflection. Detective Thomas Miller, who had carried Clara's case file on his desk through 2 decades, spent his final afternoon before retirement filing the ultimate paperwork. File 05-1024 was pulled from the cold case cabinet one last time. Miller stamped the thick, yellowed folder with a bold, red ink marker. Case closed/conviction secured. As he slid the folder back into the permanent archives, the weight that had rested on his shoulders for 21 years finally lifted. Justice had taken decades. It had required tools that didn't exist when the crime was committed, but it had ultimately arrived with absolute, unassailable force. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the borders of Oak Ridge. The success of the genetic genealogy application in identifying Pendleton led to the creation of a specialized statewide cold case forensic unit bearing Clara Vance's name. This dedicated team of scientists, genealogists, and veteran investigators was tasked with applying the same cutting-edge methodologies to hundreds of unsolved disappearances across the region. The microscopic touch DNA left on a back door latch in 2005 became the blueprint for dismantling decades of unresolved crime, offering new hope to families who had long believed their loved ones were forgotten by the passage of time. In the months that followed the trial, The empty lot on Elmwood Lane where Pendleton's house once stood was transformed into a serene public memorial park. A stone walking path wound past newly planted birch trees, leading to a simple, elegant granite bench surrounded by wildflowers. A brass plaque mounted on the stone read simply, "In memory of Clara Vance and all those who were lost in the dark, may truth always light the way home." Children played on the grass nearby, neighbors chatted as they walked their dogs, and the quiet rhythm of suburban life returned to the street, no longer shadowed by a lingering, unresolved terror. The story of the 2005 cold case was no longer a cautionary tale of fear and vulnerability. It became a testament to human persistence, scientific triumph, and the unbreakable bond of a community that refused to let the truth die. The former neighbor who had believed he had committed the perfect crime was now a forgotten number in a distant cell, while the name of Clara Vance lived on as a beacon of justice, resilience, and final, hard-won peace. The structural demolition of Arthur Pendleton's home on Elmwood Lane signaled the end of a physical landmark of horror, but the narrative of the 2005 cold case was far from over. As winter gave way to the early blooms of spring 2027, the psychological ripples of the investigation continued to unfold across the state. The clearance of Pendleton's estate and the formal closing of File 05-1024 opened a new, complex chapter for law enforcement, one that moved from the frantic urgency of a manhunt to the meticulous, sobering work of systemic review. The realization that an active serial predator had lived undetected in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac for decades forced a complete re-examination of how cold cases were classified, prioritized, and investigated across the entire country. At State Police Headquarters, a specialized task force working under the newly established Clara Vance Forensic Initiative began a sweeping audit of unsolved missing persons cases from 1975 to 2005. The primary objective was to map Arthur Pendleton's employment history, real estate acquisitions, and vehicle registration records against unsolved homicides across 5 neighboring states. Using digital spatial mapping and advanced predictive analytics, researchers laid out a grid of Pendleton's life work as an independent contractor. Every bridge he helped build, every home he renovated, and every rural property he briefly leased was cross-referenced with regional cold case databases. What emerged from this digital reconstruction was a terrifying pattern of silent mobility. Pendleton had systematically utilized the boom of suburban expansion during the 1980s and 1990s as a dark curtain. Because he worked independently, took cash jobs for minor carpentry repairs, and maintained no digital footprint during those decades, he slipped through the traditional law enforcement networks of the era. He was a phantom of the interstate highway system, a man who could commit a devastating crime in one jurisdiction, drive 2 hours down a secondary state route, and be back at a legitimate construction job site before sunrise. The cold case task force realized they weren't just dealing with a single solved mystery. They were staring into a sprawling matrix of forgotten cold cases that required years of painstaking forensic labor to fully resolve. In the quiet rooms of the State Forensic Laboratory, technicians continued the microscopic work of processing the secondary items recovered from Pendleton's hidden footlocker. The small velvet pouches, the silent catalog of trophies he had hoarded behind his furnace wall, were treated like sacred historical artifacts. Each piece of jewelry, key ring, and faded photograph was subjected to specialized chemical treatments designed to extract low-copy DNA without destroying the underlying physical material. With every successful extraction, another cold case file was pulled from the dark archives of neighboring counties, bringing long-awaited answers to families who had spent decades waiting by silent telephones. For Detective Thomas Miller, though officially retired from active duty, the lingering aftermath of the case remained a constant presence. He was regularly invited to lecture at the State Police Academy, presenting the investigation of Clara Vance's disappearance as a definitive case study in modern investigative methodology. Miller didn't focus on the sensational aspects of the crime. Instead, he taught young detectives the sobering value of patience, the danger of confirmation bias, and the critical importance of preserving biological evidence under strict chain of custody protocols. He made sure every cadet understood that the resolution on Elmwood Lane was not achieved through a sudden stroke of luck, but through 21 years of uncompromising, relentless adherence to the fundamentals of law enforcement work. Meanwhile, in the town of Oak Ridge, the transition from tragedy to healing was marked by a quiet, deliberate reclamation of public space. The memorial park on Elmwood Lane had become a cornerstone of the community. Where a dark, suspicious house once stood across from Clara's driveway, local children now gathered after school, neighbors met for morning walks, and community events were held under the shade of young birch trees. The town had refused to let the site remain a dark monument to a predator's memory. By actively filling the space with life, connection, and peace, the residents of Oak Ridge succeeded in stripping away the lingering trauma that had hung over their neighborhood since that chilly October night in 2005. Inside the high-security penitentiary where Arthur Pendleton was serving his consecutive life sentences, the passage of time brought no dramatic turns. Stripped of his freedom, his tools, his private workshop, and his hidden trophies, the 73-year-old inmate existed in absolute, sterile monotony. The arrogant, untouchable posture he had maintained for over 20 years had dissolved into the gray, uniform rhythm of institutional life. He was no longer a mysterious figure of suburban terror. He was simply a number in a state registry, completely isolated from the world he had once tried to manipulate from behind his window blinds. As the months rolled forward, the story of Clara Vance stood as a permanent testament to the power of human endurance and scientific progress. The 2005 cold case was no longer defined by the tragedy of an unsolved disappearance, but by the absolute, unyielding victory of truth over time. The town of Oak Ridge had faced its darkest hour, confronted an unimaginable betrayal by one of its own, and emerged with a deeper sense of unity and purpose. The long, agonizing search was complete, the legal record was sealed, and the memory of Clara Vance was forever preserved in the light of justice. The seasonal shift brought a crisp, invigorating air to Oak Ridge as the town moved deeper into the post-trial era. On the surface, daily life had resumed its comfortable, familiar rhythm, but beneath that calm exterior lay a transformed civic identity. The resolution of the Clara Vance case had fundamentally reshaped the town's relationship with its own history. What had once been a taboo topic, discussed only in muted whispers over back-fence gardens or avoided entirely during community gatherings, was now viewed through the lens of ultimate triumph over adversity. The long shadow cast by the unsolved disappearance had finally lifted, replaced by a profound, shared sense of closure that bound the residents together tighter than ever before. At the Regional Cold Case Task Force headquarters, the momentum generated by the high-profile arrest and conviction of Arthur Pendleton showed no signs of slowing down. The team of investigators, genealogists, and forensic specialists assigned to the Clara Vance initiative turned their full attention to the secondary cases linked through Pendleton's footlocker. Every weekday morning, the war room bustled with activity as agents mapped out geographic timelines, re-interviewed retired detectives from neighboring jurisdictions, and processed microscopic trace evidence. The success on Elmwood Lane had created a ripple effect, breathing new life into forgotten files that had sat untouched in filing cabinets for over 30 years. One by one, the silent trophies found behind Pendleton's furnace wall began to tell their devastating stories. In early autumn, the state police held a solemn, joint press conference with authorities from 2 adjoining counties. They officially announced the formal closure of 3 separate cold cases dating back to 1983, 1987, and 1994. In each instance, modern DNA extraction methods applied to the recovered personal effects, an engraved gold watch band, a silver locket, and a set of distinct keys, yielded definitive physical matches connecting Pendleton to the scenes of those long unsolved disappearances. The families of those victims, many of whom had spent decades trapped in a hellish state of uncertainty, were finally brought into the quiet circle of resolution. The public reaction to these ongoing disclosures was a mixture of profound sorrow and intense satisfaction. While the staggering scope of Pendleton's decades-long predatory career sent shockwaves across the region, it also validated the relentless, uncompromising efforts of the law enforcement officers who had refused to give up. The narrative was no longer centered on the cleverness or stealth of a serial killer, but on the unstoppable advance of scientific truth and human dedication. The image of Pendleton as an untouchable mastermind was systematically dismantled with every forensic confirmation, exposing him instead as a cowardly predator whose time had simply, inevitably run out. In Oak Ridge, the physical environment continued to evolve as a living memorial to resilience. The Memorial Park on Elmwood Lane had become much more than a quiet spot for reflection. It was now a vibrant gathering place for town events. A yearly candlelight vigil, held on the anniversary of Clara's disappearance, had shifted in tone from a somber prayer for answers to a celebration of community strength and victim advocacy. Clara's former students, now grown with families of their own, often returned to leave flowers at the granite bench, ensuring that her passion for teaching and her vibrant spirit remained the dominant narrative associated with her name. Detective Thomas Miller, now settled into his retirement, found a deep, quiet contentment in watching the town thrive. Though his daily routine no longer involved review files or crime scene walkthroughs, he remained a respected elder statesman within the investigative community. Young detectives frequently sought his counsel, visiting his home to discuss complex, cold lead cases. Miller always offered the same core piece of wisdom: never mistake time for safety, and never assume a quiet room means the truth isn't waiting to be found. For Miller, the ultimate reward for 21 years of unyielding effort wasn't the public accolades or the media attention. It was the simple, profound knowledge that Clara Vance was resting in peace, and her killer was locked away forever. Meanwhile, behind the heavy steel doors of the maximum security state facility, Arthur Pendleton's world had shrunk to the barest minimum of human existence. Stripped of the quiet, respectable mask he had worn on Elmwood Lane for decades, he was just another face in a sea of gray uniforms. The media attention that had briefly surrounded his arrest had long vanished, leaving him in total, absolute isolation. The power he had once derived from keeping dark secrets was gone. Every truth had been pulled from his hands, catalogued in public court documents, and laid bare before the world. He was left with nothing but the four concrete walls of his cell and the silent, heavy weight of his own complete defeat. As the months turned into years, the story of the 2005 cold case took its permanent place in the annals of modern criminal justice. It stood as a monument to what can be achieved when cutting-edge science is paired with unwavering human determination. The quiet suburban block of Elmwood Lane had reclaimed its peace, its dignity, and its sense of security, forever proving that no matter how deep a dark secret is buried, the truth will eventually cut through the dark and find its way home.
Part 10.
The deep autumn of 2027 settled over Oak Ridge with a crisp, rustling quiet that felt fundamentally different from the heavy, suffocating silence of years past. The town had crossed an invisible threshold. The raw shock of the arrest, the grueling details of the confession, and the dramatic demolition of the house across the lawn were no longer breaking news. They had solidified into history. Oak Ridge was no longer a town holding its breath, waiting for a missing piece of its soul to be returned. It was a community actively living in the aftermath of complete resolution, serving as a beacon for surrounding counties still wrestling with their own cold mysteries. At the state capitol, the success of the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative triggered a sweeping legislative reform known nationwide as the Oakhaven Disclosure Mandate. The law required state and municipal law enforcement agencies to automatically reevaluate physical evidence in cold cases every 5 years using newly available forensic methodologies, particularly touch DNA extraction and advanced genetic genealogy. What had been an exceptional, painstaking effort led by Detective Thomas Miller was now standard state procedure. The microscopic biological trace left on Clara's back door latch had changed the fundamental architecture of cold case investigations across the country, ensuring that time would no longer be a weapon used by predators to escape justice. Within the walls of the state police headquarters, the task force continued its methodical work on the secondary files recovered from Arthur Pendleton's footlocker. The hidden vault had yielded answers for 3 families in late 2026, but investigators refused to slow their pace. Using high-resolution digital scanning and microchemical mapping, technicians re-examined every fragment of evidence remaining in the metal locker. Every strand of fiber, Every speck of soil preserved on the velvet pouches, and every faint scratch on the recovered personal effects were matched against historical crime scene logs from across the Midwest. By mid-2027, the task force had linked Pendleton to 2 additional cold cases dating back to the late 1970s, disappearances that had stumped investigators for nearly half a century. In both instances, Pendleton had been working as an itinerant carpenter, moving between temporary housing units while working on state highway construction projects. The families of those victims, now elderly or represented by surviving children, were brought into private briefing rooms where state prosecutors presented the overwhelming genetic and circumstantial proof. Decades of agonizing uncertainty were dismantled in an afternoon, replaced by the heavy, necessary comfort of absolute truth. Back on Elmwood Lane, the physical landscape was completely transformed. The memorial park that replaced Pendleton's home was now a natural, seamless part of the neighborhood. The young birch trees planted in the spring had taken deep root, their leaves fluttering in the cool breeze over the granite bench dedicated to Clara. On any given afternoon, children could be seen riding bicycles down the cul-de-sac, their laughter echoing off the freshly painted homes, a sound that once felt impossible on a street haunted by a silent, watching monster. The physical footprint of terror had been entirely erased, replaced by the simple, enduring rhythms of ordinary life. Detective Thomas Miller spent his afternoons walking through the quiet streets surrounding the town square. Retired, yet forever bound to the story of Elmwood Lane, Miller looked at the town not with lingering trauma, but with profound relief. He often passed by the local library, where a new community reading wing had been dedicated in Clara Vance's honor. Inside, a portrait of Clara hung near the main entrance, smiling, vibrant, forever captured in her youth, not as a victim of a dark crime, but as a beloved educator whose legacy had brought an entire community out of the shadows. In the maximum security penitentiary where Arthur Pendleton spent his remaining days, the environment was devoid of drama or significance. Stripped of his secrets, his tools, and his quiet suburban anonymity, Pendleton was a forgotten figure in a bleak, uniform system. His health was failing, his eyesight dimming, and the arrogant detachment he had displayed during his initial interrogations had evolved into a dull, silent indifference. He received no visitors, requested no legal appeals, and remained entirely isolated from the outside world. The man who had spent decades playing a dark, invisible game of survival was now completely trapped within the silent, inescapable reality of his own actions. As the months ticked forward, the narrative of the 2005 cold case reached its final, permanent altitude. It stood as an unassailable proof that no crime is truly hidden forever, that no secret can withstand the relentless march of human persistence and scientific progress, and that a community built on trust can survive the deepest possible betrayal. The hunt was long finished, the ledger was balanced, and the truth, once buried deep under layers of concrete and time, sat securely in the light, forever guarding the peace of the town that had fought so hard to find it. The snow began to fall early over Oak Ridge in the late months of 2027, laying a clean, silent blanket of white over the cul-de-sac of Elmwood Lane. It drifted softly across the wide lawns, settled over the roofs of the renovated craftsman houses, and gently covered the granite bench in the memorial park. 22 years after a front door was left swinging open in an October breeze, the winter landscape felt different. It was no longer a cold, desolate scene of an unsolved nightmare, but a quiet, pristine layer of peace over a town that had finally reclaimed its soul. The final legal and administrative chapters of the case had reached their absolute conclusion. The State Attorney General's office officially released its comprehensive, 700-page final report on the Arthur Pendleton multi-jurisdictional investigation. The document was a masterwork of modern forensic science, detailed timeline reconstructions, and victim-centered closure. It systematically cataloged every lead from 2005, every microscopic analysis performed on the touch DNA sample from the rear door latch, every genetic mapping branch that brought investigators to Pendleton's doorstep, and every recovered trophy from the metal footlocker hidden behind his furnace wall. The report served as a definitive textbook for police departments across the globe, a masterclass in how unwavering human determination, combined with revolutionary technology, can shatter a decades-old lie. At the state police headquarters, the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had grown into a permanent, fully funded division. What started as a dedicated task force to solve a single suburban missing person case was now an elite, state-of-the-art center for cold case resolution. Dozens of analysts, genealogists, and veteran detectives worked side by side in high-tech laboratories, utilizing the precise methodologies refined during the Elmwood Lane investigation. Families from across the country, whose cases had languished in dark storage archives for 20, 30, or 40 years, now looked to Oak Ridge as a symbol of hope. The microscopic cells left on a brass latch in 2005 had sparked a national revolution, ensuring that no missing person would ever be forgotten, and no predator could rely on the passage of time as a shield. On Elmwood Lane, the neighborhood had fully healed from the trauma that had haunted its pavement for more than 2 decades. The empty space where Pendleton's house once stood was no longer seen as a scar. The memorial park had matured into the vibrant heart of the block. On winter evenings, warm yellow lights hung from the branches of the birch trees, illuminating the stone paths where neighbors walked and children built snowmen. The quiet handyman who had once spied on his neighbors through half-drawn blinds was completely erased from the physical space. In his place stood a testament to communal resilience, a living space defined by light, safety, and mutual care. In late November, the town gathered at the local high school for a ceremony dedicated to Clara Vance's enduring legacy. A permanent scholarship fund, created in her name by her family and former students, was established to support young women pursuing careers in science and education. Clara's aging parents sat in the front row, surrounded by the very people who had stood with them through 21 years of dark, agonizing uncertainty. As student after student stepped up to receive the award, Clara was remembered not for the violent, dark manner of her death, but for the brilliant, luminous impact of her life. The narrative had been entirely reclaimed. The victim was no longer defined by the predator, but by the love and justice that fought to bring her home. Detective Thomas Miller, now fully settled into the quiet rhythms of retirement, stood at the back of the auditorium during the ceremony. He looked over the crowd, at the young officers he had mentored, at the neighbors who had survived the dark years, and at the bright, hopeful faces of the students on stage. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the small, worn notebook he had carried throughout the entire investigation, the notebook where he had written Clara's name on October 25, 2005. He knew that his career, his life's work, and his promise to a grieving family were finally complete. The file was closed, the truth was secured, and justice had been delivered in full. Miles away, within the bleak, concrete walls of the state maximum security penitentiary, Arthur Pendleton's final hour arrived without fanfare, audience, or drama. Old, frail, and completely forgotten by the outside world, he passed away quietly in his cell, isolated from the community he had once tried to terrorize and control. His death warranted only a brief, formal sentence in the back pages of the regional newspaper, a stark contrast to the front-page banners that had once detailed his arrest. The man who had tried to build an impenetrable fortress out of secrets and lies was gone, leaving behind no legacy, no defense, and no lingering shadow. His name was swallowed by the silence of history, while the names of his victims were restored to the light, honored, remembered, and forever protected. As the late winter night deepened over Oak Ridge, the snow continued to fall softly over Elmwood Lane. The street was quiet, warm, and peaceful. The porch lights flickered on one by one along the row of homes, illuminating the snow-covered driveways and the clear, open paths. The long, agonizing hunt was over. The dark mystery that had gripped a town for 21 years was finally laid to rest. The cold case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and in the deep, undisturbed quiet of the evening, the truth sat secure, forever at home in the light. The quiet onset of 2028 brought a calm to Oak Ridge that felt fully anchored in reality rather than mere recovery. The story of Clara Vance was no longer a fresh wound, nor was it a speculative mystery discussed on late-night true crime podcasts. It had transitioned into a permanent, settled pillar of regional history. The town moved forward, not by attempting to forget the dark 21-year interval, but by integrating the lessons of that trial into the very fabric of its everyday identity. The panic that had once lingered at the edge of every unlit street had faded, replaced by an enduring, clear-eyed awareness of the strength that lies in community solidarity and uncompromising justice. At the state level, the administrative machinery set in motion by the resolution of File 05-1024 operated at peak efficiency. The Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had expanded its reach beyond state lines, establishing a regional clearinghouse that pooled advanced genetic genealogy data, touched DNA profiles, and historical contractor registries across 6 neighboring jurisdictions. The methodology forged in the pressure cooker of Elmwood Lane was now codified into federal law enforcement training modules. Investigators from around the globe studied the case not merely for its high-tech resolution, but as a textbook study in maintaining evidentiary integrity over decades. The microscopic skin cells recovered from that brass door latch in 2005 remained a symbol of scientific triumph over time, a warning to predators that no secret is safe from the future. In the state capitol, the Archives Unit completed the digitization of all records associated with Arthur Pendleton's multi-decade trajectory. The resulting database allowed cold case units across the country to cross-reference unsolved disappearances from the 1970s onward against Pendleton's verified movements, credit applications, and construction permits. This systematic cataloging yielded closure in 2 additional out-of-state cold cases that year, quietly providing answers to families who had spent 40 years in the dark. The narrative of Pendleton as an invisible, untraceable phantom was systematically dismantled entry by entry, replaced by a cold, mathematical record of his ultimate failure to evade justice. On Elmwood Lane, spring returned with a vibrant, quiet beauty. The memorial park that stood where Pendleton's house once sat had fully bloomed, its birch trees casting long, soft shadows over the granite bench dedicated to Clara. The park was no longer visited out of morbid curiosity. It had simply become part of the neighborhood's daily life. Parents pushed strollers along the stone paths, elderly neighbors sat in the sun reading newspapers, and local school groups occasionally visited to plant flowers as part of civic science projects. The land had been thoroughly cleansed of its dark past, reclaimed by the steady, unbothered rhythm of ordinary human connection. Across the lawn, the Vance home remained a symbol of endurance. Though Clara's parents had eventually passed the property down to her younger brother, the family maintained the Craftsman house with quiet pride. The porch light that had flickered over an empty driveway on that fateful October night in 2005 now shone brightly every evening, casting a warm glow over a home filled with new memories, family gatherings, and the laughter of a new generation. The darkness that had invaded the home 23 years prior had been entirely evicted, replaced by the warmth of a family that had refused to let grief ruin their future. Retired Detective Thomas Miller spent much of his time now writing a memoir focused on the evolution of forensic science and the human cost of cold case investigations. He worked from a sunlit study overlooking the Oak Ridge Valley, surrounded by notebooks, archival photographs, and letters of gratitude from families across the nation. Miller did not write to seek fame or highlight his own role. His goal was to leave behind an honest record of what it takes to fight for a victim when all leads have dried up and the world has moved on. He dedicated the manuscript to Clara Vance and to every investigator who refuses to let a file go cold. In the state penitentiary, the room where Arthur Pendleton had spent his final days was now occupied by another inmate, his name and presence completely washed from the facility's routine records. No monuments marked his passing, no family claimed his estate, and no public statement was issued beyond the official state registry notation. The predator who had spent a lifetime relying on anonymity to inflict terror had died in total, absolute irrelevance. His attempt to control the narrative of his life and his crimes had crumbled into complete oblivion, while the names of his victims remained forever preserved, honored, and surrounded by light. As the afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the rooftops of Elmwood Lane. The quiet suburban block settled into the evening air. The streetlights clicked on in unison, lighting up the sidewalk where neighbors walked and children played their final games before dusk. The long, dark chapter that had begun on a chilly autumn night in 2005 had reached its ultimate, unshakable ending. The truth had won, the town had healed, and in the serene, undisturbed quiet of the neighborhood, peace reigned supreme, permanent, unbroken, and forever secure. The morning light of early summer 2028 spilled across Oak Ridge, illuminating a town that had fully stepped out from the shadow of its past. The 23-year saga of Clara Vance's disappearance, the forensic triumph that unmasked Arthur Pendleton, and the subsequent dismantling of a decades-long trail of quiet terror had finally settled into its permanent place in the historical record. What remained was not a town marked by grief, but a community that stood as a national model for endurance, civic trust, and forensic innovation. At the Oak Ridge Police Department, the physical footprint of File 05-1024 had transformed. The dedicated war room that had once housed floor-to-ceiling evidence boards, timelines, and surveillance maps had been decommissioned and converted into the regional hub for the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative. Armed with ultra-sensitive digital sequencing tools and direct access to expanded public genetic databases, a new generation of investigators sat at those same desks. They were not chasing ghosts with dead-end tips. They were systematically breaking through cold cases from across the state using the precise blueprint forged during the Pendleton investigation. The impact of this institutional shift was felt far beyond the municipal borders. Law enforcement agencies from across the country regularly sent cold case units to Oak Ridge to study the mechanics of the 2005 breakthrough. They didn't just review the chemistry of touch DNA or the algorithms of genealogical tree building. They studied the human element, the uncompromising refusal of Detective Thomas Miller and his team to let a file be buried by the passage of time. The lessons of Elmwood Lane were published in criminology journals and taught at police academies worldwide. A crime scene is never truly silent, and time is no longer a shield for those who operate in the dark. In the state capitol, the multi-agency task force finalized its master cross-reference log detailing Pendleton's life and movements. By compiling historical highway toll records, vintage property deeds, commercial building permits, and banking records from 1970 through 2005, researchers created an undeniable digital map of his whereabouts across 5 decades. This exhaustive timeline allowed state police units in 3 neighboring states to officially clear 4 additional unresolved missing persons files, closing the books on mysteries that had haunted small rural towns for nearly half a century. Each confirmation brought a quiet, profound peace to aging relatives who had spent decades searching for answers, proving that the reach of justice extended into the deepest corners of the past. On Elmwood Lane itself, the rhythm of daily life moved with a light, easy grace. The memorial park at the former site of Pendleton's home was now a lush, green sanctuary anchored by mature birch trees and vibrant flower beds maintained by neighborhood volunteers. The granite bench dedicated to Clara Vance had become a natural resting point for residents on evening walks. The fear that had once forced neighbors to lock their doors early and glance suspiciously across their lawns was completely gone, replaced by a deep-seated, active sense of community care. Directly across the grass, the Vance residence stood as a beacon of warmth and stability. Clara's brother, now living in the renovated Craftsman home with his young family, ensured that the house remained filled with light, music, and life. The back door, where a single microscopic trace of evidence had once held the key to an entire investigation, had been restored, its polished brass hardware catching the afternoon sun. The home was no longer defined by the intrusion of October 2005. It was defined by the resilience of the family that refused to let terror dictate their future. Retired Detective Thomas Miller completed the final chapter of his investigative memoir that summer. Sitting on his porch overlooking the valley, he reviewed the bound manuscript titled The Silence of Elmwood Lane, Forensic Genealogy and the Pursuit of Truth. Miller avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on the painstaking labor, the emotional toll on the families, and the revolutionary science that brought a predator to justice. He arranged for all royalties from the book to be directed to the Clara Vance Scholarship Fund, ensuring that the resolution of the case would continue to generate positive, life-changing opportunities for young people for generations to come. In the state penal system, the administrative memory of Arthur Pendleton had dissolved entirely. The physical cell where he spent his final days had long since been reassigned, his personal effects discarded, and his record closed under state statute. The predator, who had spent 30 years relying on suburban anonymity to hide his dark deeds, had been completely erased from the world he had sought to manipulate. He left behind no defenders, no legacy, and no unanswered questions, only a cold, mathematical record of total judicial defeat. As twilight settled over Oak Ridge, lighting up the tree-lined streets with the warm glow of street lamps, the town embraced the quiet evening air. Children's bicycles lay on front lawns, open windows carried the sounds of dinner conversations, and neighbors greeted one another along the sidewalks of Elmwood Lane. The long, grueling journey from a chilling 2005 cold case to complete, unassailable resolution was finished. The hunt was over, the ledger was balanced, and the truth sat secure in the light, unbroken, permanent, and forever at peace. The high summer of 2028 settled into a warm, gold-hued calm over the valley of Oak Ridge. For the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, the turning of the calendar held no dread, no pending anniversaries of unsolved tragedy, and no haunting, unanswered questions. The narrative of Clara Vance, which had once existed as a dark, open wound on the town's conscience, had achieved a rare and complete narrative finality. It was no longer a story waiting for its ending. It was an established monument to human resilience, scientific precision, and the relentless pursuit of justice. At the state capitol's Department of Public Safety, the overarching legacy of File 05-1024 reached its administrative apex. The Clara Vance Forensic Initiative was officially designated as the central command node for all multi-jurisdictional cold case operations across the region. The high-tech facility, outfitted with cutting-edge genomic sequencing equipment and automated genealogical mapping systems, had evolved far beyond its humble origins as a targeted task force. It was now a permanent institution, staffed by top-tier forensic geneticists, cyberanalysts, and seasoned homicide detectives. The fundamental truth established on Elmwood Lane, that time is powerless against the advancement of physical evidence, had become the foundational philosophy of modern law enforcement across the state. The ripple effect of this institutional revolution continued to bring unexpected solace to far-flung communities. The comprehensive database built from Pendleton's historic footprint, tracking 5 decades of his commercial receipts, vehicle transfers, and independent carpentry contracts, led to the resolution of 2 final, deeply buried cold cases in neighboring states late that summer. In both cases, microscopic biological trace evidence, preserved in police archives since the late 1980s, was matched definitively to Pendleton using the touch DNA protocols perfected during the Vance investigation. For the elderly siblings and children of those forgotten victims, the sudden arrival of long-overdue answers felt like a light piercing a room that had been dark for 40 years. The myth of Pendleton as an unassailable, invisible ghost was completely dismantled, exposed instead as a trail of careless errors that science eventually caught up with. In Oak Ridge, the physical geography of the town reflected a place that had been entirely restored to its people. Elmwood Lane was no longer a destination for curious true crime tourists or solemn media crews. It was simply a quiet, thriving suburban street where life unfolded without fear. The Memorial Park stood at the heart of the block, its birch trees fully leafed out, providing cool shade over the granite bench dedicated to Clara. On warm afternoons, the park was alive with the simple, beautiful sounds of normal life. Neighbors chatting across the stone walkways, dogs playing on the green grass, and local students gathering to read. The physical space where a predator had once plotted in secret had been transformed into an enduring sanctuary of community connection. Across from the park, the Vance family home stood bathed in summer sunlight. Clara's brother and his family had completed a quiet, respectful restoration of the property, preserving its classic craftsman architecture while filling its rooms with warmth, art, and laughter. The rear door latch, The tiny piece of metal that had silently guarded the killer's DNA for 21 years was now part of a permanent educational display at the State Police Academy's Forensic Museum, serving as a physical reminder of the power of physical evidence. On Elmwood Lane, the new brass fixture on the door gleamed in the sun, a symbol of safety restored and a home reclaimed. Retired Detective Thomas Miller spent his summer days traveling to major universities and criminal justice academies, delivering keynote lectures on the ethical and procedural lessons of the Vance case. Miller did not speak as a heroic figure, but as a public servant who had simply refused to break a promise. He emphasized to young cadets that modern forensic tools, no matter how revolutionary, are only as effective as the integrity of the officers who preserve the evidence in the first hours of an investigation. His upcoming memoir had already been selected for integration into police academy curricula nationwide, ensuring that the methodical, patient approach that solved Clara's case would guide the next generation of investigators for decades to come. Within the state corrections infrastructure, the name of Arthur Pendleton had drifted into total, unceremonious obscurity. The physical cell where he spent his final, isolated years was continuously occupied by new offenders. His personal medical files were archived under routine state retention laws, and his legacy was reduced to a cold statistic in a master registry of convicted felons. He had sought to control the world around him through terror and secrecy, but in the end, he was entirely forgotten by the world he tried to victimize. His name held no power, his memory inspired no fear, and his dark secrets were forever laid bare in the bright, uncompromising light of public record. As evening fell over Oak Ridge, the soft glow of street lamps illuminated the pristine sidewalks of Elmwood Lane. Windows along the street were thrown open to catch the cool summer breeze, carrying the faint sounds of music and dinner preparations into the quiet night air. The long, agonizing journey from an October nightmare in 2005 to full, unassailable justice was complete. The cold case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and the truth sat permanent and secure, forever watching over the peace of the town that never gave up. The turning of late autumn in 2028 brought a crisp, golden clarity to the valley of Oak Ridge, marking the final, permanent settling of a narrative that had once held an entire state in suspense. The 23-year chronicle of Clara Vance's disappearance, from the haunting silence of an open door in October 2005 to the high-tech forensic breakthroughs that brought Arthur Pendleton to justice, had reached its complete, unshakable conclusion. The case was no longer an active file, a subject of legal debate, or a lingering source of communal anxiety. It had taken its place as a cornerstone of modern criminal justice history, a masterclass in how unwavering human persistence, when aligned with revolutionary science, can dismantle decades of calculated deception. At State Police Headquarters, the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had achieved full operational maturity. The division, which began as an aggressive cold case task force built specifically to solve the mystery on Elmwood Lane, was now recognized as the national gold standard for genetic genealogy and touch DNA analysis. Its specialized laboratory housed state-of-the-art sequencing equipment capable of building complete genomic profiles from microscopic biological samples previously deemed unusable. Detectives and forensic scientists from across the globe regularly traveled to the facility to observe its protocols, studying how the meticulous preservation of evidence back in 2005 had ultimately allowed modern technology to extract a definitive profile 21 years later. The systemic impact of the initiative extended far beyond technical training. The comprehensive geographic database constructed around Arthur Pendleton's life, mapping 5 decades of his work as an independent contractor, his vehicle purchases, tool rentals, and real estate transactions, served as a primary blueprint for multi-jurisdictional cold case audits across 5 states. By cross-referencing this digital map against historical unsolved missing persons reports from 1970 to 2005, law enforcement agencies were able to systematically close the final remaining secondary files linked to Pendleton's movements. For the families of those long-forgotten victims, the arrival of clear, scientifically verified answers provided a quiet, profound resolution, ending generations of painful uncertainty and proving that time offers no sanctuary to a predator. In Oak Ridge, The physical and emotional recovery of the community was absolute. Elmwood Lane had long shed its status as a site of tragedy. It was once again a thriving, peaceful suburban cul-de-sac defined by connection and trust. The memorial park that stood where Pendleton's home once sat had grown into a cherished neighborhood sanctuary. Its mature birch trees framed a central lawn where children played, while the granite bench dedicated to Clara Vance remained a tranquil spot for morning reflection. The park was not a dark monument to a killer's crimes, but a living testament to a town's refusal to let fear dictate its future. Directly across the street, the Vance family home stood illuminated by the warm light of early evening. Clara's brother and his family had seamlessly woven new life into the historic craftsman structure while maintaining a deep, quiet respect for its past. The rear entrance, where a microscopic cluster of skin cells on a brass latch had once held the key to the entire mystery, had been restored with care. The home was no longer associated with the violation of an October night. It was filled with family dinners, school projects, and the easy laughter of a new generation growing up in safety. Retired Detective Thomas Miller, having published his authoritative memoir on the case, spent his time mentoring young investigators and advising national cold case coalitions. Miller's work ensured that the core principles demonstrated throughout the Elmwood Lane investigation, uncompromising chain of custody protocols, radical transparency with victim families, and patience in the face of dead ends, were embedded into the standard curriculum of law enforcement academies nationwide. He didn't view the resolution of File 05-1024 as a personal victory, but as the fulfillment of a solemn oath made to a grieving family and a shaken town 23 years earlier. In the state penal system, the legacy of Arthur Pendleton was non-existent. The physical space he occupied during his final, isolated years had been reassigned, his records locked in state archives, and his name erased from public discourse. The predator who had spent decades relying on suburban anonymity and hidden trophies to maintain a sense of power had died in total, absolute irrelevance. His attempt to control his narrative crumbled under the weight of scientific truth, leaving behind no mystery, no lingering influence, and no unanswered questions. As twilight settled over Oak Ridge, the street lamps along Elmwood Lane flickered on, casting a soft, golden glow across the paved sidewalks and quiet front lawns. The crisp evening air carried the familiar, comforting sounds of a neighborhood at peace. The long, agonizing search for answers that had begun in 2005 was over. The hunt had concluded, the legal record was sealed, and in the deep, undisturbed calm of the evening, the truth sat secure, permanent, unassailable, and forever guarding the light. The deep winter of 2028 returned to Oak Ridge with a soft, heavy snowfall that draped the roofs, driveways, and trees of Elmwood Lane in a thick layer of white. Across the neighborhood, warm light poured from living room windows onto pristine snowbanks, casting a soft yellow glow over the quiet cul-de-sac. 23 years after the initial shock of Clara Vance's disappearance shattered the peace of this suburban enclave, the street felt entirely transformed. The long, agonizing narrative of suspicion, cold leads, forensic breakthroughs, and legal finality had finally reached its ultimate plateau, a state of permanent, undisturbed calm. At the state police headquarters, the administrative footprint of the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had expanded into a regional model of law enforcement excellence. The dedicated team of forensic geneticists, cyberanalysts, and seasoned homicide investigators operated with a single, clear mandate to ensure that no cold case in the state was ever allowed to gather dust in a dark archive. Using the precise protocols established during the 2026 breakthrough, combining low-copy touch DNA extraction with multi-tiered genealogical database mapping, the initiative had systematically worked through dozens of backlogged missing persons files from across the region. The vast digital ledger constructed around Arthur Pendleton's 5-decade history as an independent carpenter was now a permanent, fully cross-referenced resource. Investigators from neighboring states continued to query the database, matching historical land records, cash receipts, and equipment rental logs against cold case files from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. With every new match confirmed by genetic testing, another family was brought out of the dark. The myth of Pendleton as a phantom who could commit crimes without leaving a trace had been thoroughly shattered by modern science. He was exposed as a predator whose reliance on time and distance was ultimately dismantled by the advance of physical evidence. In Oak Ridge, the physical environment reflected a community that had reclaimed its space, its history, and its future. The memorial park on Elmwood Lane, where Pendleton's house once stood, was quiet under its blanket of snow. The young birch trees planted in memory of Clara held heavy caps of white, their delicate branches framing the central granite bench. Neighbors walking their dogs along the cleared stone paths often paused there, not to dwell on the horror of the past, but to appreciate the quiet sanctuary that had taken its place. The park was no longer a symbol of a crime scene. It was the living heart of a neighborhood that had fought its way back to peace. Across the lawn, the Vance home stood as a warm beacon of resilience. Clara's brother and his family had preserved the integrity of the classic craftsman structure while filling its halls with light, warmth, and new life. The porch light, which had once burned through long, dark nights of uncertainty, now shone over a driveway where children built snowmen and shoveled paths for elderly neighbors. The rear door latch, the tiny brass component where a few microscopic skin cells had waited 21 years to deliver justice, was gone, but the security and trust it restored remained permanent. Retired Detective Thomas Miller, now an elder statesman in the criminal justice community, spent his winter mornings reviewing transcripts for guest lectures at university law schools. His memoir had become required reading for investigative trainees nationwide, teaching them that high-tech tools are only as powerful as the patience and meticulous chain of custody protocols behind them. Miller didn't look back at the case with vanity. He viewed it as a solemn duty fulfilled. The notebook where he had written Clara's name in October 2005 sat closed on his desk, a silent testament to a promise kept. In the state penal system, the memory of Arthur Pendleton was entirely erased. The concrete cell where he spent his final days had long since been reassigned to other inmates, his administrative files consigned to routine state storage archives, and his name forgotten by the public. The man who had spent decades relying on suburban anonymity to harbor dark secrets had died in total, absolute irrelevance. His dark legacy had been dissolved by truth, leaving behind no unanswered questions, no lingering power, and no influence over the living. As the winter night deepened over Oak Ridge, the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing the street in a serene, unbroken hush. Porch lights flickered along the block, illuminating clear walkways and warm, welcoming homes. The long, agonizing hunt was over. The cold case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and in the deep, undisturbed quiet of the evening, the truth sat secure, permanent, unassailable, and forever at home in the light. The arrival of spring in 2029 brought a vibrant, renewed energy to the valley of Oak Ridge. The snow that had blanketed Elmwood Lane through the long winter melted away, revealing lush green lawns and early perennial blooms along the stone walkways. 24 years after the quiet afternoon in October 2005 when Clara Vance vanished without a trace, the story that had once gripped the entire region in fear had reached a state of permanent, serene resolution. It was no longer a headline, a mystery, or an open file. It had become an unassailable chapter of local history defined by the victory of persistence, community strength, and forensic truth over time. At the state police headquarters, the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had expanded into a regional cornerstone for cold case resolution across the Midwest. The high-tech facility, birthed from the relentless effort to solve File 05-1024, operated at the bleeding edge of forensic genetic genealogy and low-copy DNA processing. Detectives, forensic pathologists, and bioanalysts from law enforcement agencies nationwide regularly visited the lab to study its operational framework. They were not merely learning how to run complex algorithms or isolate microscopic skin cells from aged materials. They were absorbing a paradigm shift in how cold cases are prioritized, one built on the foundational premise that no lapse of time can erase physical evidence. The comprehensive spatial and temporal mapping project centered on Arthur Pendleton's 5-decade trajectory reached its final, exhaustive completion that spring. By integrating vintage land deeds, historical employment records, cash receipts, and interstate transit logs from 1970 to 2005 into a unified predictive database, the task force had created an undeniable record of Pendleton's movements. This master registry allowed law enforcement agencies in neighboring states to close out the final lingering secondary inquiries associated with his work as an independent contractor. Families across 3 states who had spent 30 or 40 years trapped in silent grief were brought into quiet rooms to receive definitive, scientifically verified closure. The myth of Pendleton as an unassailable, invisible predator was utterly destroyed, replaced by a cold, mathematical record of his complete forensic defeat. In Oak Ridge itself, the physical environment stood as a living testament to a town that had reclaimed its security and its soul. Elmwood Lane had long shed the dark notoriety that once drew media trucks and true crime onlookers. It was once again a peaceful, ordinary suburban cul-de-sac where neighbors chatted across property lines and children rode bicycles down the middle of the street. At the heart of the block, the memorial park created on the site of Pendleton's demolished home was in full bloom. Its birch trees cast long, soft shadows across the granite bench dedicated to Clara, where residents frequently sat to read or enjoy the quiet morning air. The park was not a gloomy memorial to tragedy, but a bright, open sanctuary celebrating community resilience. Directly across the lawn, the Vance family home remained a beacon of warmth and stability. Clara's brother and his family had preserved the classic craftsman architecture while filling its rooms with music, art, and family gatherings. The rear entrance, where a microscopic biological trace on a brass latch had silently guarded the truth for 21 years, had been restored with care. The house was no longer associated with the cold intrusion of an October afternoon. It stood as a place of lasting peace, owned and cherished by the family that had refused to surrender hope. Retired Detective Thomas Miller spent his spring afternoons finalizing a series of guest lectures for national law enforcement academies. His memoir on the Vance investigation had been integrated into criminal justice curricula across the country, serving as a primary text on chain of custody protocols, victim family advocacy, and the integration of genetic genealogy in legacy cases. Miller viewed his work not as a personal victory, but as the fulfillment of a solemn promise made to a grieving family and a shaken town nearly 24 years earlier. His original case notebook, worn at the edges, containing the initial notes taken on October 25, 2005, sat closed in his home study, a quiet symbol of a mission fully accomplished. In the state penal system, the administrative memory of Arthur Pendleton had dissolved into total irrelevance. The physical cell where he spent his final days was occupied by new inmates, his medical records were archived under routine state statutes, and his name was never mentioned in public discourse. The predator who had relied on suburban anonymity to harbor dark secrets had died in total isolation, leaving behind no legacy, no influence, and no unanswered questions. His attempt to control his narrative was completely dismantled by truth, while the names of his victims were restored to light, honor, and permanent peace. As twilight settled over Oak Ridge, the street lamps along Elmwood Lane flickered on one by one, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet sidewalks. Windows were thrown open to the mild evening breeze, carrying the comforting sounds of dinner preparations and gentle conversation into the night. The long, agonizing hunt for answers was over. The cold case was solved, the legal record was sealed, and in the deep, undisturbed quiet of the valley, the truth sat secure, permanent, unassailable, and forever at home in the light. Part 18. The long summer of 2029 descended on Oak Ridge with a quiet, shimmering warmth that wrapped the valley in absolute serenity. 24 years after Clara Vance's sudden disappearance shattered the town's quiet rhythm, the narrative that had once defined this community had completed its long, inevitable journey from unimaginable horror to total, unassailable resolution. Elmwood Lane was no longer a symbol of unresolved trauma or a landmark of suburban mystery. It was simply a quiet, thriving street where families lived, children played, and neighbors trusted one another implicitly. At State Police Headquarters, the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative had solidified its status as an international beacon for cold case investigations. The initiative was no longer viewed as an experimental task force, but as an indispensable pillar of modern law enforcement infrastructure. The high-tech laboratory, housed within the State Forensic Wing, operated at the absolute cutting edge of genetic genealogy, touch DNA sequencing, and automated historical mapping. Police departments from across the nation and international law enforcement partners from Europe and North America sent their elite cold case investigators to Oak Ridge to study the methodologies that had solved File 05-1024. The underlying philosophy taught at the initiative was rooted in the lessons of Elmwood Lane. Physical evidence is timeless, and no predator can ever outrun the inevitable advance of scientific truth. The microscopic cluster of skin cells recovered from that brass door latch in 2005 had become a classic case study in police academies worldwide. Cadets were taught that the integrity of an initial crime scene investigation, no matter how cold the lead becomes, is the single most critical factor in allowing future generations of scientists to deliver justice. Meanwhile, the comprehensive historical reconstruction of Arthur Pendleton's life work reached its absolute, final archive phase. The spatial and temporal database built from 5 decades of Pendleton's receipts, vehicle transfers, independent construction permits, and real estate transactions was officially integrated into the federal cold case database. This massive digital matrix allowed state police agencies to review decades of cold cases against Pendleton's precise geographic footprint. Through this systematic audit, investigators were able to confirm physical and genetic links to 2 final unresolved cases in rural townships miles from Oak Ridge, bringing long-awaited answers to families who had spent over 40 years in the dark. With these final closures, every thread connected to Arthur Pendleton's dark, secret double life had been completely unraveled. The myth of the quiet, invisible handyman who could live among his neighbors while hiding horrifying secrets was thoroughly dismantled. He was laid bare not as an untouchable mastermind, but as a pathetic, careless predator whose physical mistakes ultimately caught up with him through the sheer, unyielding persistence of the law. In Oak Ridge, the physical landscape reflected a town that had completely healed. At the heart of Elmwood Lane, the Memorial Park stood in full summer bloom. The birch trees planted on the plot where Pendleton's home once sat had grown tall and full, their leaves whispering softly in the warm afternoon breeze. The granite bench dedicated to Clara Vance remained a central gathering place, not for mourning, but for life. Young parents rested on the bench while watching their toddlers play on the grass. Elderly residents sat in the shade reading books, and high school students gathered after class to talk and laugh. The park had successfully fulfilled its mission, to erase the dark memory of a killer's home and replace it with a living monument to peace and community resilience. Directly across the cul-de-sac, the Vance home stood as a picture of warmth and stability. Clara's brother and his family had preserved the historic craftsman architecture while filling its rooms with love, music, and new memories. The rear door, where a tiny biological trace had silently guarded the truth for 21 years, was kept in pristine condition. The home was no longer viewed as a crime scene or a place of sadness. It was a home defined by the strength of a family that had refused to give up hope, standing as a testament to the fact that light will always overcome the dark. Retired Detective Thomas Miller spent his summer afternoons in his sunlit study overlooking the Oak Ridge Valley, putting the finishing touches on the expanded edition of his memoir. His book, which detailed the 21-year hunt for Clara's killer and the revolutionary science that solved the case, had become a national bestseller and a standard textbook in criminology programs. All proceeds continued to fund the Clara Vance Memorial Scholarship, providing educational opportunities for young women pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice. Miller looked out over the quiet town with a deep, profound sense of peace. The notebook where he had written Clara's name on October 25, 2005, Saturday on his shelf, closed, complete, and fulfilled. In the state penal system, the memory of Arthur Pendleton was non-existent. The cell where he had spent his final, isolated years had been reoccupied long ago. His medical and legal files were locked away in routine state storage archives, and his name was never spoken. The man who had spent decades relying on suburban anonymity to harbor dark secrets had died in complete, total irrelevance. His attempt to control his narrative had been utterly destroyed by truth, leaving behind no power, no influence, and no unanswered questions. As twilight gently fell over Oak Ridge, the street lamps along Elmwood Lane flickered on one by one, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet sidewalks and green lawns. Open windows carried the sounds of dinner conversations, laughter, and evening music into the soft summer air. The long, agonizing search for justice that had begun on a chilly autumn day in 2005 was completely over. The cold case was solved, the ledger was balanced, and in the quiet, undisturbed evening, the truth sat secure, permanent, unassailable, and forever guarding the peace of the town. The quiet transition into the autumn of 2029 brought a crisp, familiar rustle of fallen leaves to the cul-de-sac of Elmwood Lane. 24 years after the dark October afternoon when Clara Vance's disappearance halted the heartbeat of Oak Ridge, the town existed in a state of absolute, effortless equilibrium. The long, painstaking journey from an open missing persons file to a landmark forensic breakthrough, followed by the complete dismantling of Arthur Pendleton's dark legacy, had reached its final, permanent altitude. There were no more court dates, no more press conferences, and no remaining secondary leads to pursue. The case was fully, irrevocably closed. At State Police Headquarters, the Clara Vance Forensic Initiative operated not as a symbol of past success, but as a living engine of daily justice. The specialized unit had become the premier cold case laboratory in the nation, routinely processing microscopic evidence samples for municipal departments across the country. The laboratory's advanced genomic sequencing protocols, developed specifically to handle the degraded, low-copy touch DNA extracted from the Vance crime scene, had set a new baseline for evidence handling nationwide. Every technician who trained at the facility was required to study File 05-1024, learning that the true power of forensic science lies in the uncompromising discipline of the initial investigation. The master digital database mapping Pendleton's 5 decades of mobility as an independent contractor had been fully archived within the federal system. Every commercial permit, property transaction, tool rental receipt, and highway toll record from 1970 to 2005 had been cross-referenced, checked, and double-checked against regional missing persons registries. With the final secondary cold cases officially resolved in the spring, the ledger was clean. The phantom who had spent 30 years moving silently along interstate corridors, taking advantage of jurisdictional gaps and the limits of 20th century forensics, had been stripped of every secret he possessed. In Oak Ridge, the physical landscape reflected a community that had completely reclaimed its narrative. The memorial park on Elmwood Lane had matured into a seamless, vibrant part of the neighborhood's daily routine. The young birch trees planted on the lot where Pendleton's dark, suspicious home once stood were now tall and strong, their golden autumn leaves fluttering gently over the granite bench dedicated to Clara. Children walked through the park on their way home from school. Neighbors paused to chat near the stone walkways, and evening strollers rested under the warm light of the park's solar lamps. The soil had been thoroughly cleansed of its dark history, replaced by a living space defined by safety, connection, and peace. Directly across the street, the Vance residence stood bathed in the warm, late afternoon sun. Clara's brother and his family had filled the Craftsman home with new life, preserving its classic character while creating a bright, welcoming environment for a new generation. The rear entrance, where a tiny cluster of skin cells on a brass latch had silently guarded the killer's identity for 21 years, remained a quiet point of family pride, a reminder that truth and perseverance had ultimately prevailed over evil. The home was no longer defined by the tragedy of 2005.